Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we invite you to settle in for the haunting story of Alpo Martinez, Harlem's flashy kingpin, smooth talker, ruthless killer, and the ghost who couldn't stay gone. He rose fast, betrayed many, vanished into witness protection, and then came back to the very streets he once ruled, until fate caught up with him one last time. Before we begin, drop a comment. Where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? We love watching this growing underworld of night owls and true crime lovers from every corner of the map. Now, let the noise of the day fade, let the streets go quiet, and prepare to walk through Harlem's shadowed past, where betrayal echoes louder than bullets. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. Born into the game. The man behind the wheel looked like a memory that had slipped out of Harlem's past and refused to stay dead. The streets had long buried his name beneath layers of betrayal, blood, and silence. And yet, there he was, driving slow, windows down, like it was still the 80s, like time hadn't moved on without him. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not in Harlem. Not in public. And especially not under his real name. But for Alpo Martinez, being invisible had never felt natural. After nearly 2 decades in witness protection, after testifying against the very people he once called family, after dismantling a kingdom brick by brick to save himself, he had returned to the place where it all began. The ghosts of his past hadn't forgotten him. The streets had never forgiven him. But before the headlines, the million-dollar drug runs, and the body count that would make even seasoned hitmen flinch, before the betrayal that would echo through the underworld for years, there was just a boy growing up in the heart of East Harlem. A boy with too many questions, not enough answers, and a hunger in his chest that no meal could ever fill. East Harlem in the late 1970s wasn't a place for the soft or the slow. It was a neighborhood balanced on the edge of beauty and struggle, a place where the rhythms of salsa and soul poured out of windows cracked open for breeze. And yet the very sidewalks carried the stain of what poverty and neglect could do to a community. The buildings loomed tall, brick and worn, covered in graffiti that didn't just mark territory, it told stories. Stories of love lost, friends gone too soon, and promises that never made it past the stoop. This was the world Alpo was born into. His mother worked long shifts cleaning offices downtown, trying to keep her son on the right path with the weight of the world on her back. His father was a ghost, absent before Alpo could ever remember a face. With no real guide, no map, and no safety net, Alpo learned early that if he wanted anything in this world, he'd have to take it. As a kid, Alpo was quick, not just on his feet, but in his mind. He watched everything. The way the older boys hustled on the corner, how they nodded to each other without speaking, how the soft-spoken ones somehow carried more weight than the loudmouths. He wasn't the biggest or the toughest, but he didn't need to be. He had charm like a con man and instincts like a predator. Even as a teenager, he carried himself like someone who already knew how the story would end. In the classroom at Benjamin Franklin High School, he was forgettable, a student who showed up, barely passed, and mostly stared out the window like he was already somewhere else. But outside, when the school bell rang and the streets came alive, that's when the real learning began. At first, it was little things. Holding a package for someone, running messages between blocks, watching a stash while an older guy disappeared into a building. He earned their trust not by talking tough, but by never slipping. In a world where one wrong move could get you cut out, or worse, Alpo was flawless. He listened more than he spoke. He learned the code. On the block, the rules weren't written down, but everyone knew them. Loyalty was everything, but even that came with an expiration date. Respect was the real currency, and fear? Fear was how you kept people in line when respect ran dry. By the time he was 15, Alpo had made a name for himself. Not because he'd done anything outrageous yet, but because people noticed how others started listening when he talked. He had presence. That kind of thing you can't teach. What drove him wasn't just the money. That came later. What fueled Alpo from the start was deeper, a need to matter. In a city of millions, packed with noise and movement, he wanted to rise above it all. He wanted Harlem to know his name and speak it with either respect or fear. Either would do. But that kind of ambition is dangerous, especially when you're still just a kid. The boys he ran with were hungry too, each one chasing something different. Some wanted out of the neighborhood. Some wanted power. Others just didn't want to be invisible. One night, a friend named Junebug sat with Alpo on a stoop, eyes glassy from weed and exhaustion, and said, "I just want to walk into a store and buy whatever I want. That's it. Just once." That was the kind of desperation that hung in the air like heat in the summer. Quiet, heavy, and impossible to ignore. By the early 80s, the game was shifting. Crack cocaine was making its way into Harlem, and it moved fast, faster than anyone could control. It was cheap, potent, and devastating. And for young dealers like Alpo, it was opportunity disguised as poison. He understood something most didn't. The product wasn't the key, the psychology was. People didn't buy crack just because they wanted to get high. They bought it because it made the pain go quiet. And in neighborhoods built on pain, silence was priceless. He didn't fall into the trade. He chased it, targeted it, studied it like a surgeon studies anatomy. He watched which dealers lasted and which ones got taken out, either by rivals or by their own recklessness. The ones who survived weren't just ruthless. They were smart, calculated, cold when they needed to be, charming when it served them. Alpo would be both. His first real break came when he approached a mid-level dealer named Tito. Tito had a small crew and tight distribution, but he wasn't ambitious. He liked to keep things low. Alpo saw the gap, saw how much product was moving and how much more it could be. He walked up to Tito one night, calm and confident, and said, "I can move your work faster than your whole crew." It wasn't bravado, it was a pitch. Tito gave him a test pack, just a few grams. Alpo sold it in under an hour. Came back with the money still warm from the customer's hand. Tito didn't say much, just nodded and handed him more. That was the beginning of something. Word spread quickly. In the drug world, nothing moves faster than buzz. Suddenly, Alpo wasn't just a street kid. He was the one to watch. The one with juice. The one with promise. Money came fast. So did women, cars, and enemies. At 17, Alpo was moving weight that most grown men couldn't handle. He upgraded his wardrobe, leather jackets, gold chains, sneakers fresh out the box. He didn't just have money. He looked like money. Girls were drawn to him, not just because of what he had, but how he carried it. There was a girl, Keisha, who used to wear the same jean jacket every day. She saw through the noise. Told him once, "You're gonna die or disappear before you're 21. He laughed, said maybe, but I'll make sure they remember me. It wasn't arrogance. It was prophecy. But the streets don't let anyone rise without payment. One night, Alpo came home late, blood on his sleeve, eyes distant. His mother saw the stains. He walked past her without a word, climbed the stairs, and shut the door. She didn't ask. Maybe she already knew. Maybe she'd seen too many boys become men too soon, only to disappear in the same breath. That was the life. The unspoken cost of power. The quiet truth that behind every dollar was a debt waiting to be collected. Then came the first body. Not by his hand, but close enough. A close friend, Rico, shot dead in a stairwell. Wrong place, wrong time. The bullet wasn't meant for him, but in the streets, death doesn't care about intention. At the funeral, Alpo stood in the back, face stone cold. He didn't cry, didn't flinch, just stared at the casket like he was staring at his own fate. That day something hardened inside him. A piece of warmth gone. He realized something crucial, that loyalty couldn't stop a bullet, and the game didn't love anyone back. Still, he kept moving. He had plans. Harlem was just the beginning. His eyes were set on something bigger, Washington, D.C. A city wide open. A city where his name didn't yet carry weight. That was about to change. Alpo didn't just want to be rich. He wanted to be remembered, wanted to be legendary. And the next step would make him both. But power always comes with a price. And as Alpo's legend grew, so did the shadows around him. Whispers turned to stares. Feds circled like vultures. Enemies smiled to his face and sharpened knives behind his back. He was stepping into a larger world now, one with higher stakes, colder betrayals, and fewer exits. Alpo was ready to play the game. But what he didn't know yet was that the game had already begun playing him. Chapter 2. Harlem's Hustle Culture. The echo of a gunshot on 125th Street didn't turn heads anymore. By the mid-1980s, Harlem had learned to live with noise, the loud kind that came from engine revs, shouting deals, blasting boomboxes, and sometimes, the sudden crack of violence slicing the night open. What caught people's attention now wasn't the sound. It was who hit the ground. That night, it was a boy no older than 16. Face first in the gutter. Sneakers still spotless. In his hand, a small twist of plastic, barely enough to get high, but enough to die for. The block fell quiet. Someone muttered, "He was just getting started." And that said everything. In Harlem, the streets didn't care how far you planned to go. The game played favorites with no one. You could climb fast, shine hard, but all it took was one misstep, one jealous glance, one wrong word, and you were done. In that storm of survival, style, and street law, Alpo Martinez rose like a meteor. But he wasn't alone. He came up in a time when Harlem was the epicenter of a drug revolution, reshaped by a new chemical profit, crack cocaine. It arrived like a whisper and spread like fire. Cheaper, more addictive, easier to move in bulk. It was the perfect storm for a generation of hustlers who had no time to wait and no fear of consequence. Harlem had always had hustle in its blood. From jazz clubs to corner dice games, from policy bankers to bootleg liquor runners, it was a neighborhood raised on ambition and artful survival. But in the 80s, that energy changed tempo. It sped up, got sharper, money moved faster, lives burned shorter. And the ones who figured out the new rules early, like Alpo, started building empires before they were old enough to legally drink. You could feel it in the air, that mix of danger and desire. The corners weren't just places to hang out anymore. They were open-air markets. Boys who once traded basketball cards now traded vials of crack, moving weight with military precision. Drug spots were run like businesses. Shifts, territories, lookouts, runners. It wasn't chaos, it was organized. And beneath it all, violence waited like a coiled snake, ready to strike whenever business got personal. For Alpo, this wasn't just a way to make money. It was an art form. He studied the flow of product like a stockbroker watching tickers. He learned which corners were hot, which crews were weak, and how to flip an ounce into a fortune. He wasn't just buying and selling. He was building influence. One handshake at a time. One favor owed. One reputation cemented in whispered rumors and unspoken threats. The thing about crack cocaine, it didn't just destroy the users. It remade the dealers. It turned teenage boys into street millionaires. Turned quiet kids into killers. It didn't just open doors, it kicked them off the hinges. And Alpo? He walked through every one of them with a smile and a plan. There was a rhythm to it all. In the morning, the bodegas opened. The old ladies swept their stoops, and the smell of frying bacon drifted through the air. But by noon, the blocks changed. The colors got brighter. The cars got louder. Hustlers came out in gold chains thick as rope, leather jackets hanging off their shoulders like armor. It was theater, power on display, and Alpo was one of its stars. He'd pull up in a candy-painted motorcycle, music thumping, crowds parting like the Red Sea. But behind the flash, behind the smooth talk and toothy grin, was a mind built for strategy. He didn't just want money, he wanted dominance. And Harlem, in all its elegance and grit, gave him the perfect stage. But every throne attracts challengers. And every territory had its rules. Crews controlled corners like kingdoms, and stepping 1 foot too far could start a war that would leave mothers crying and murals blooming on brick walls. Respect wasn't just earned, it had to be enforced. Sometimes with a fist, sometimes with a bullet, and sometimes with a quiet visit in the night that sent a clear message. This isn't a game. Alpo understood that. He didn't just use violence. He wielded it like a surgeon's scalpel, clean, precise, and only when absolutely necessary. At least in the beginning. He knew how to talk his way out of problems, how to make allies out of rivals, how to flip situations in his favor without ever pulling a trigger. But even the smoothest operator eventually hits a wall. In Harlem, no one stays untouched. The money flowed like water. Thousands of dollars moved through hands every day, and with every sale, the stakes got higher. A rival crew might rob your stash spot. A jealous friend might talk to the cops. A girlfriend might get picked up and crack under pressure. Paranoia wasn't just natural, it was survival. Trust became currency. And betrayal? That was the silent killer, waiting in backrooms and whispered phone calls. The dealers didn't just run drugs. They ran blocks, paid rent for families, gave out turkeys on holidays, bought bikes for neighborhood kids. They were both feared and adored, saints and devils in the same breath. The police knew their names. So did the preachers. Everyone had a stake in the game, even if they pretended not to. Alpo thrived in that space between legend and threat. He was young, yes, but he was calculating, magnetic, and dangerous in all the ways that made him impossible to ignore. His name traveled fast, not just in Harlem, but in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and eventually all the way down to Washington, D.C. And every time someone said his name, it came with a story. Some true, some twisted, but all powerful. Behind the glamour, though, the streets were rotting. Crack didn't just get people high, it hollowed them out. Mothers lost sons. Sisters turned to ghosts. Families broke down under the weight of addiction and loss. Entire buildings were gutted, turned into trap houses or abandoned shells of what once was home. And through it all, the money never stopped. Dealers like Alpo didn't ignore the damage. They just couldn't afford to feel it. In that world, emotions were liabilities. Regret got you killed. Empathy made you weak. So they hardened. Not just their hearts, but their faces, their decisions, their sense of right and wrong. Morality wasn't a compass. It was a luxury. And luxuries didn't survive long in Harlem. One day, a kid barely out of middle school came up to Alpo on the corner. Said he wanted in. Said he'd do anything. Alpo looked at him, skinny, wide-eyed, desperate, and said, "You sure?" The kid nodded. Alpo handed him a package. That kid disappeared a year later, shot behind a building for shorting the wrong person. No one even blinked. That was the cost of the game. Harlem was glitter and gunpowder, beautiful and brutal. And in the middle of it all, Alpo kept climbing. His outfits got flashier. His crew got tighter. His enemies got bolder. And the streets, those hungry, listening streets, they kept watching, waiting. By 19, Alpo had more money than most men see in a lifetime. But the higher he rose, the harder it became to tell who was loyal and who was lying. The streets praised him, but they also resented him. Admiration turned to envy. And in a world built on ego and vengeance, nothing was more dangerous than being loved too loudly. He couldn't slow down, couldn't trust too easily, couldn't stop, even when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. Because now it wasn't just about making it. It was about staying made, about staying alive. The crack game had changed Harlem forever. And in many ways, it had changed Alpo too. What began as survival had become an obsession, a pursuit of something beyond money, immortality, to be remembered, to become legend. But legends come with enemies. And Alpo's next move would put him on a collision course with one of the most respected names in the game. A partner, a brother, a man whose death would shake the streets to their core. The drug business wasn't just about hustle anymore. It was about decisions. Life or death, loyalty or leverage. And Alpo was about to make a choice that would echo through Harlem for generations. Chapter 3. The Making of a Dealer. The first time Alpo held real weight in his hands, he didn't flinch. It wasn't excitement or fear that gripped him, it was clarity. The product was soft white, tightly sealed in plastic, barely the size of a candy bar. But it might as well have been a live grenade. In the streets of Harlem, holding that much crack cocaine meant you were no longer just a kid trying to survive. You were someone to watch. Someone who could rise. Or someone who could die. He was 16. Just a teenager with quick hands, a faster mouth, and a hunger that ran deeper than most could see. The man who handed him the package was older, seasoned, with eyes that had seen too much. He told Alpo, "Don't talk. Don't flash. Move smart, and don't trust nobody." Then he disappeared into the stairwell, leaving Alpo on the edge of a choice that would define the rest of his life. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, staring at the bag on his dresser like it held the keys to the universe. And in a way, it did. Because in Harlem, crack was more than just a drug. It was a currency, a language, a weapon, and a curse all rolled into one. It didn't just change lives, it rewrote them. And Alpo had just picked up the pen. He started small, one hand to hand at a time. Always moving, always alert. Never staying in one place long enough to get caught or remembered. He learned how to read people, how to spot a cop from half a block away, how to count money with his eyes and measure respect by how long someone hesitated before speaking his name. There was an art to it all, a rhythm, and Alpo had perfect timing. Word spread fast, not just because he was good, but because he was different. He smiled when others scowled. He made jokes during tense moments, defused conflict before it sparked, and somehow made people feel like working with him was safer than working against him. Even the older guys started noticing. One of them, a low-level player named BJ, once said, "That kid don't hustle like he's scared. He hustles like he's already made." But charm only took you so far, and the streets always tested you. The first time someone tried to rob him, Alpo didn't hesitate. He pulled a blade from his sock and slashed the guy across the face, clean and fast. Blood hit the sidewalk before anyone realized what had happened. It wasn't about the money. It was about sending a message that Alpo might smile with you, laugh with you, even eat with you, but cross him, and he'd turn cold in a second. That moment changed everything. Now people respected him, feared him even, not because he was the biggest or meanest, but because he was unpredictable, like a switchblade in a velvet case. You never saw the blade until it was too late. By 17, Alpo was moving enough weight to draw serious attention, the kind that made cops watch from unmarked cars and rivals whisper in backrooms. But he wasn't reckless. Not yet. He kept his circle small and his plans tight. His early mentor, a Dominican dealer who ran a corner near Park Avenue, taught him how to layer operations, how to move product through younger kids, keep distance from the stash, and never get too comfortable. That man once told him, "The moment you think you're untouchable, you're already dead." Alpo listened, took it all in. But deep down, he didn't believe it. He saw himself as different. Not just a survivor, but a builder. Someone who would take the chaos of Harlem and carve out something lasting. Something legendary. He started dressing sharper. Slick leather coats, crisp sneakers, gold that caught the light just right. He wasn't just showing off, he was advertising. Power, confidence, control. People noticed. Girls leaned in when he spoke. Young hustlers asked for advice. OGs started offering him bigger plays. But the higher he climbed, the darker the air became. Late one night, he sat in a diner with an older connect from the Bronx. They were talking numbers, routes, and a potential shipment that could double Alpo's profits overnight. In the booth behind them, a kid was slouched with a hoodie pulled low. He kept glancing over. Alpo clocked him, nodded once to his man, and without missing a beat, adjusted his position so he could see the door. "Always watch the exits," the connect said quietly. "'Cause sometimes the enemy don't knock, they walk right in." Paranoia wasn't a weakness in the drug game. It was armor. And Alpo was learning how to wear it without letting it slow him down. He started recruiting. Not friends, employees. People who could move with purpose. He built a small crew, each member selected for a reason. One for muscle, one for speed, one for silence. He moved like a general, mapping out corners like battlefields, studying foot traffic like a field commander planning a strike. And through it all, his name kept growing. He wasn't just selling drugs, he was selling an image. A myth. The young dealer who smiled in your face, joked with cops, flirted with girls, and still had enough edge to scare killers into second thoughts. He became a story, the kind that kids told each other on stoops, the kind that made enemies nervous. But every story has a twist. One evening, just after sundown, one of his runners got snatched by a rival crew. Beaten, stripped, and left in an alley with a warning scrawled across his chest in marker, "Stay out of our lane." Alpo responded that same night. Not with guns, but with pressure. He hit their supply line, flipped two of their workers, and sent word to their boss. "You can lose money or lose people. Your choice." They backed down. That move earned him something more valuable than money, reputation. Not just for power, but for precision, for handling business without drawing heat. He was still young, still learning, but Harlem started to see him as more than a rising star. He was becoming a force. But power has gravity, and the bigger your name, the more weight you carry. Soon, Alpo began attracting attention from heavy hitters outside Harlem. Brooklyn, Queens, even D.C. They'd heard of him. Some wanted to work with him. Others wanted to test him. One night, he was introduced to a dealer from Washington, D.C., a man with a smooth voice and dead eyes. They sat in a back room of a lounge, the smoke thick, the tension thicker. The D.C. man asked Alpo, "You ready to move real weight?" Alpo didn't hesitate. "I've been ready." That deal would change the course of his life. But even in that moment, surrounded by shadows and ambition, Alpo kept his cool. He smiled, leaned back, and played his part like he'd rehearsed it 100 times. Outside, Harlem kept moving. Sirens, laughter, barking dogs, and the steady hum of survival. But inside that room, a new chapter was beginning. One that would pull Alpo further into the game, deeper into danger, and closer to the edge than he'd ever been. He wasn't just making money anymore. He was making history. But the streets don't keep records of glory. Only debts. Only scars. And Alpo Martinez was about to find out that the higher you climb in this world, the thinner the air gets. And the harder it becomes to breathe. Chapter 4. Streets of Fire. The Rise of a Young Kingpin. The flames were already licking at the frame of the BMW when the sirens screamed through the night. The body inside was still slumped behind the wheel, face unrecognizable, chest riddled with holes. The car, torched for effect, sent thick black smoke spiraling above East Harlem like a signal flare. It wasn't the first body to hit the pavement that summer, and it wouldn't be the last. But this one had meaning. It was a message, a warning, a chess move carved into steel and fire. And somewhere, not far from the scene, Alpo Martinez stood watching from the shadows. No emotion, no panic, just calculation. Because in the world he now ruled, violence wasn't chaos. It was a language. And Alpo had become fluent. By the time he turned 18, Alpo wasn't just known in Harlem. He owned it. Not with deeds or documents, but with fear and admiration. He moved with the ease of someone who no longer questioned whether he belonged. The corners weren't just places he passed through. They were extensions of his will. His crew held down blocks like military units. Every man had a role, a purpose, and loyalty was non-negotiable. Betrayal didn't just get you exiled, it got you erased. Money was flowing faster than it could be counted. Tens of thousands a week, sometimes more. Stacked in shoeboxes, stuffed into duffel bags, hidden in basements and car trunks. The crack boom was peaking, and Alpo was one of the few young players who had the charisma to unify his crew and the ruthlessness to defend it. He wore custom leather jackets with his name stitched across the back, rode motorcycles through the streets like a rock star, pulled up in candy-colored convertibles with music thumping and a girl in every seat. Harlem had seen hustlers before, but not like this. And yet, the flash wasn't just for show. It was strategy. Power in the drug world was psychological. It wasn't just about how much you had. It was about how much people believed you had. The image mattered. Looking like a king made people think twice before trying to take your crown. It wasn't ego, it was armor. But with every rise comes resistance. The more Alpo's name spread, the more rivals tried to test him. Turf wars weren't always loud shootouts. Sometimes they were quiet sabotage. Someone slipping false information to the cops. A stash spot getting raided at just the wrong time. A runner disappearing with 10 grand worth of product. The streets were filled with ghosts of grudges. Every smile had a crack in it. Every handshake a hidden knife. Alpo kept his circle close. He trusted few, but those who earned it were treated like family. He paid well, protected fiercely, and demanded everything in return. Loyalty wasn't just appreciated, it was required. One of his closest guys once said, "Working with Po was like being in a fire. If you could take the heat, you came out shining. If not, you burned." That wasn't exaggeration. Alpo's leadership was built on clarity. Cross him, and there were no second chances. His apartment wasn't a home, it was a command post. Stacks of cash in dresser drawers. guns hidden behind ceiling tiles, phones with numbers memorized, changed weekly. Girls came and went, but business always came first. On the surface, it looked like luxury, but underneath, it was pressure. Constant, unrelenting. Because in the world Alpo had built, one mistake didn't just cost money, it could cost everything. Still, he moved like someone blessed. Untouchable. He dodged raids, beat charges, and survived ambushes. Stories started to swirl. How he once talked a rival leader down with just a smile and a nod. How he'd walked into the heart of enemy territory alone and left with respect instead of bullets. Some of it was myth. Some was fact. But all of it fed the legend. And Alpo knew how to use legend like a weapon. But power has weight. And Harlem wasn't just watching him. It was depending on him. Families were eating off his payroll. Crews were surviving off his decisions. The pressure didn't show in his face, but it pulsed in his every move. He couldn't sleep without a gun under the pillow. Couldn't eat in public without someone watching the door. Couldn't trust anyone fully, not even those closest to him. One night, as he sat alone in a car overlooking the East River, a rare silence settled around him. The city lights flickered in the water. His phone buzzed in his lap, ignored. He lit a cigarette and stared ahead. There was no music, no girls, no crew, just Alpo and the cold realization that success in the streets came with a toll. The more you had, the more you stood to lose. And the higher you climbed, the lonelier it became. But slowing down wasn't an option. He was in too deep. Harlem had crowned him, and the streets didn't allow for retirement. He had to keep pushing, expanding, protecting. Every day was a battlefield. Every friend could be a future threat. Every alliance a ticking clock. The rivalries got bloodier. One crew tried to move in on his territory, thinking the young kingpin had grown too comfortable. They were wrong. Within days, 3 of their guys were laid out, and the rest vanished into silence. Alpo didn't need to boast. The message was clear. This was his empire, and trespassing came with consequences. But the violence took its toll. One of his young runners, just 15, got caught in crossfire while walking home. Wrong place, wrong time. The funeral was quiet, small. Alpo didn't attend, but he paid for everything. A gesture of guilt or responsibility, no one knew. But behind closed doors, he reportedly punched a wall until his knuckles bled. The street life didn't care about intentions, only outcomes. And this one had hit closer than most. To escape the tension, he started spending time in Washington, D.C. A different city, a different game, but the same rules. Down there, he was still Alpo, but with less baggage. He made connections, planted seeds. But Harlem remained his heart. No matter where he went, the city pulled him back. The cars got faster, the chains heavier, but so did the whispers. The feds were watching, rivals were regrouping, and inside his own circle, cracks were forming. Some of the old loyalty was fading, replaced by envy. It always happened eventually. The longer you sat on the throne, the more people wanted to see you fall. Still, Alpo pushed forward. Ruthless, brilliant, unapologetic. He understood the game in a way few did. He didn't just react, he anticipated. Stayed 3 steps ahead. But even the sharpest mind couldn't see everything coming. And deep down, he knew it. He once told a girl during a quiet moment, "One day, they'll either kill me or write about me." He said it with a smirk, but his eyes didn't smile. The streets had made him a king. But kings don't sleep easy. Not when the crown is bloodstained. Not when the fire never stops burning. And somewhere, in the shadows of his empire, a storm was building. A name was rising. A connection that would take Alpo to new heights and drag him into the deepest betrayal of his life. Chapter 5. Meeting Rich Porter. The first time Alpo Martinez met Rich Porter, it wasn't in a boardroom or a back alley. It was in Harlem, the kingdom they both wanted to conquer. The air between them that day buzzed with silent understanding. 2 young men locked into the same orbit, each one radiating power, charm, and ambition. Rich had Harlem's respect, earned through years of steady grinding, clean moves, and a loyalty that felt sacred to the streets. He wasn't just a dealer. He was a legend in real time, a young prince raised under the glow of streetlights and reverence. Alpo, by contrast, was still rising, still burning with the hunger to be seen, felt, and feared. He walked like a man who had already imagined his own mural on the wall. When their worlds finally collided, something irreversible ignited. It was the kind of connection that rewrites street maps, one that made people step back and say, if these two link up, it's over. Together, they didn't just make money, they defined an era. Harlem hadn't seen a pairing like this before. Rich with his velvet smoothness, his eyes always calculating, his presence calm and magnetic. And Alpo, loud, impulsive, daring, a lightning rod for danger and desire alike. They complemented each other like night and thunder. It didn't take long for their partnership to flood Harlem's underworld with new energy. They moved product faster than most crews could dream of, stacking thousands upon thousands a week, stretching their reach down into D.C., across boroughs, and into whispered conversations in clubs and street corners. It wasn't just about supply anymore. It was about dominance. People didn't just buy from them. They studied them. They copied the clothes, the slang, the swagger. In those years, Alpo and Rich were more than dealers. They were culture. But street empires are built on balance. Trust is the thread that holds it all together, and in a world fueled by paranoia, that thread frays quickly. Alpo admired Rich's composure, but behind the admiration grew a silent resentment. Rich had connections that ran deep. Uncles, cousins, friends, people who had his back not because of money, but because of blood and history. Alpo, born into chaos and raised on instinct, had built everything with his bare hands. His loyalty was bought, not inherited. As the money got heavier and the stakes grew higher, that contrast started to cut deeper. Alpo wanted to be the top, not second, not equal, the top, and standing beside Rich Porter, Harlem's golden child, meant sharing a spotlight. Alpo had always dreamed of standing in alone. The tension grew slowly, like smoke before a fire. Small disagreements turned into long silences. Deals that once flowed smoothly began to feel choked by suspicion. One night, in a smoky backroom with just 2 chairs and a silent third man holding a pistol in the shadows, Alpo accused Rich of skimming from a shipment. The words weren't loud, but they were sharp. Rich didn't rise to it. He sat back, arms crossed, and stared through Alpo with a look that said, "You really think I need to steal from you?" He denied it calmly, said the numbers were solid, the heat was real, and everyone needed to be smarter. But to Alpo, that calm sounded like condescension. And once a man like Alpo felt slighted, the clock started ticking. They tried to hold it together. Publicly, they still moved as a unit, still rode together, still celebrated wins like brothers. But behind the scenes, each was retreating into his own world of whispers. Alpo began moving more product through his own channels, cutting corners, sidestepping routes Rich had helped establish. Rich, in turn, became more guarded, tightening his inner circle and watching Alpo with a careful eye. The streets noticed. The smiles between them looked different now, tighter, emptier. The warmth was gone, replaced by the cold shadow of something coming. Something nobody could name, but everyone felt. And then came the wound that shattered the bond beyond repair. Rich's 12-year-old brother was kidnapped, snatched off the street like a pawn in a much larger game. The ransom call was brutal, $500,000. $500,000, with no time and no guarantees. Harlem held its breath. The city that had admired Rich now wept for him. Everyone expected the dealers, the hitters, the heavyweights to mobilize. Alpo offered money, made calls, showed support. But the energy wasn't the same. Something inside him had begun to calcify. When the boy's lifeless body was found, discarded off the side of a road, executed like a soldier in a forgotten war, it felt like the rules of the game had collapsed. Harlem went silent. And Rich was never the same again. After the funeral, something in Alpo changed. Or maybe it finally revealed itself. He didn't mention the boy again. Didn't bring it up. Just kept moving, faster than before. Rich was unraveling in grief, trying to hold the pieces together, and Alpo, he was expanding. Some say he saw the weakness. Some say he simply couldn't carry the weight of someone else's pain. Whatever it was, the distance between them became a canyon. They clashed again, this time over a missing shipment. Nearly $80,000 gone with no explanation. Alpo pointed fingers. Rich refused to grovel. He said what he had always said, "I don't play games." But Alpo wasn't playing either. To him, this wasn't about money. It was about respect. And respect, in his world, was worth more than anything. What happened next was whispered about in every barbershop, every dice game, every jail cell across the 5 boroughs. Rich Porter, Harlem's prince, its symbol of pride and loyalty, was found dead, shot multiple times, his body left cold on the side of a Bronx road. His family didn't know where he was until the news aired. The city mourned like it had lost a son. People cried in the streets. Murals went up overnight. The streets spoke his name in the same breath as Biggie, as Malcolm, as ghosts who left too soon. Alpo said nothing. At least not then. He kept moving, stayed clean, acted like grief wasn't his to wear. But those close to him noticed a change. He laughed less, drank more, trusted no one. And every time his name was mentioned, it carried a different weight, not just of power, but of betrayal. The crown he'd fought so hard to wear now dug into his scalp like a thorn. The streets were still his, yes, but they didn't love him anymore. They feared him, respected his ruthlessness. But love? That had died with Rich. For years, no one could prove what everyone believed, that Alpo had ordered or even pulled the trigger himself. He was too slick, too calculated. But Harlem has a memory. And the streets? They remember everything. That alliance, once the most powerful force Harlem had seen in a generation, ended not with a bang, but with silence. A silence so loud it still echoes in stairwells, in old cassette tapes passed around behind bars, in the eyes of a city that once believed in loyalty and bled when it was broken. Alpo had proven his power, no doubt about it. But in killing Rich, he crossed an invisible line. And deep down, even he knew, there are some ghosts you don't outrun. Chapter 6, The Washington Heights Pipeline. The gunshots echoed through the quiet Washington, D.C. night like punctuation at the end of an unspoken sentence. A man lay sprawled across the concrete outside a rundown corner store, blood seeping from his chest, his last breath already spent. There were no witnesses, no screaming, no chaos, just the emptiness that follows when violence becomes routine. For Alpo Martinez, this was the new sound of business. Harlem had raised him. D.C. would crown him. And between those two cities, a silent, deadly highway was now paved with cash, drugs, and corpses. It began not with a plan, but with a whisper. A contact in Washington Heights spoke of untapped markets, cities where New York's product could flood the streets without resistance. Washington, D.C. was hungry, already boiling in the heat of a crack epidemic, but with fractured networks and no central power. A place like that needed someone bold, someone with vision, someone ruthless enough to unify chaos with a single, unshakable will. Alpo didn't hesitate. He saw the opportunity, and like he always did, he moved fast. At first, it was simple. He'd send a few trusted soldiers down south, young guys who knew the weight of loyalty. The plan was to supply the local dealers, build connections, feel out the terrain. But Alpo didn't just want to be a supplier. He wanted to be the supplier. The one whose name didn't just ring out in Harlem, but echoed all the way through Southeast D.C., through Adams Morgan, through Maryland and Virginia like a warning wrapped in respect. And for that, he'd have to be there in person. When he touched down in D.C., it was like Harlem had arrived with him. The cars, the clothes, the energy. He was louder than anything the streets there had seen. And people noticed. Some welcomed it. Others, not so much. There were already crews in place, local boys who had carved out territory with blood and quiet fear. To them, Alpo wasn't a visionary. He was a problem, a flashy New Yorker with too much mouth and too little patience. But Alpo didn't play politics. He played dominance. And he made it clear, you could join him or vanish. Those were the only two lanes. He began locking down corners not with negotiation, but with pressure. His crew operated like a disciplined militia, swift, brutal, and loyal. He had lieutenants who handled the day-to-day, and foot soldiers who enforced his vision with terrifying precision. His prices undercut the locals, His product was purer, more addictive. And his tactics? Merciless. If someone shorted him, they didn't just get a warning. They got erased. And as the bodies began to stack, so did the profits. But success didn't just come from blood. Alpo understood the power of image. In D.C., he wore gold ropes thicker than the steering wheel of his Benz. He handed out $100 bills like they were flyers. He threw parties in hotel suites that dripped with champagne and sin. To the young and impressionable, he was a god. To his enemies, he was a ghost. Everywhere and nowhere, impossible to predict and harder to stop. He formed new alliances with dealers who saw his rise as a ticket out of poverty. Some joined out of greed, others out of fear. But once they were in, there was no backing out. Alpo didn't tolerate doubt. He built his empire like a fortress, every layer designed to protect him from exposure, betrayal, or collapse. He had mules moving weight along the I-95 corridor, safe houses spread across the metro area, and couriers trained to vanish at the first sign of heat. But expansion brought pressure. The violence in D.C. wasn't like Harlem. It was raw, personal, and chaotic. Guns were cheap. Respect even cheaper. The city was filled with young killers who didn't care about Alpo's reputation. To them, he was just another target worth a name. And yet, Alpo walked the streets like he was invincible. Even when a hit was ordered on him, one that nearly succeeded, he didn't slow down. He simply struck back harder. One by one, his rivals disappeared. Some were found in alleys. Others never surfaced at all. The message was clear. Alpo didn't come to share. He came to reign. And the more blood he spilled, the more his legend grew. But legends are fragile things. The more people talk about you, the more they want to see you fall. Inside his own circle, cracks were beginning to form. Money was pouring in, but so was paranoia. Some of his crew started asking questions about decisions, about missing shipments, about who was really in charge. And Alpo, never one to let suspicion simmer, responded the only way he knew how, with silence and sudden violence. He turned on former allies with surgical brutality, removing threats before they became problems. Loyalty became a prison sentence. Once you were in, you stayed in, or you disappeared. The pipeline between New York and D.C. had become more than a route. It was an artery, pumping poison into two cities like a heartbeat of destruction. And Alpo was its pulse. Every week, new shipments. Every month, more bodies. The streets were getting colder, meaner. And behind the scenes, the feds were taking notes. Quietly, patiently. Because while Alpo was building his empire in the open, law enforcement was assembling a case in the dark. Still, he felt untouchable. The money insulated him. The fear protected him. The legend emboldened him. He'd survived Harlem, dominated D.C., and now he was something else, something more than a drug dealer. He was a myth walking in daylight. And myths don't bleed. Or so he believed. But power doesn't grow in a vacuum. It casts shadows, creates enemies in silence. People who smile in your face but count your steps. Men in suits gathering evidence. Friends whispering into recorders. Alpo didn't know it yet, but the very highway that made him rich was about to lead him somewhere he couldn't control. One night, while sitting in a D.C. apartment surrounded by cash, coke, and women, he reportedly looked around and said, "This is what kings do." But even kings have executioners. And the men circling Alpo weren't looking to join. They were looking to bury him. He had built something massive, something terrifying. But in the drug world, growth is always a gamble. The more you win, the closer you are to losing everything. And somewhere on the streets he now owned, someone was watching him, waiting, ready to move. Chapter 7. Harlem Royalty. The night sky over Harlem flickered with blue and red reflections as the Ferrari idled outside a packed nightclub, its engine humming low like a predator beneath the surface. People stopped and stared, some in awe, others in quiet fear. The door opened slowly, and out stepped Alpo Martinez, dripping in diamonds, wrapped in leather, the air around him thick with tension and admiration. He didn't walk like a man who was merely rich. He walked like someone who had bent Harlem to his will. And in that moment, under neon lights and camera flashes, he looked less like a drug dealer and more like a myth carved in gold. But just beyond the shine, something darker was crawling up from beneath the surface, a slow, creeping rot that power always brings with it. At his peak, Alpo wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. His presence in Harlem was absolute. The way he dressed, the way he spoke, the cars he drove. Every detail was carefully curated to intimidate and inspire. On any given night, he could be seen in a candy-painted motorcycle leading a pack of riders through the streets, or stepping out of a new luxury coupe with the doors swinging open like wings. Women adored him. Hustlers imitated him. Children pointed when he passed. To the outside world, Alpo had it all. But what they didn't see, what he refused to show, was the weight of maintaining that illusion. Every smile he gave came with calculation. Every dollar spent was an investment in fear. The streets respected him, yes, but they also watched him with uneasy eyes. People who had once cheered for his rise were now measuring their chances of surviving his fall. Harlem had crowned Alpo royalty, but the crown came with blades. And even he was beginning to feel them press against his scalp. He controlled blocks like a chessboard, his crew spread wide, operating with ruthless efficiency. Every man in his circle knew their role, and they played it with religious obedience. But power that burns fast also burns hot, and trust was always the first casualty. He began testing the loyalty of those closest to him, feeding them false information just to see where it leaked. Some failed, and when they did, they disappeared. Not with drama, not with spectacle, just gone. Because Alpo didn't need to make noise to be terrifying. His silence was louder than gunshots. Behind the scenes, Harlem had become a battlefield. Every move Alpo made shifted the balance of power. And those who couldn't adapt, or wouldn't kneel, found themselves buried beneath it. He was accused of ordering hits on friends, partners, even men he once called brothers. But in his world, business was colder than blood. If a man became a threat, he didn't get a warning, he got erased. Still, the parties continued. Champagne poured like water. Penthouse suites hosted celebrations that blurred into chaos. Hundreds of thousands changed hands in back rooms. Models, athletes, and musicians all came and went, orbiting around the glow of Alpo's rising sun. But deep in the quiet of those nights, when the laughter faded and the music dimmed, Alpo would sometimes sit alone, a pistol in his lap, eyes staring through the window at the city he ruled. And in those moments, even he couldn't lie to himself. He was running out of space to breathe. The paranoia grew like mold. He started switching cars mid-drive, sleeping in different apartments each night, ordering his crew to watch each other, then watch the watchers. He smiled less, trusted no one. Every room he entered was a potential trap. Every handshake came with the twitch of a trigger finger. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control. And Alpo wasn't about to give up an inch. But the empire was getting too big, too noisy, too visible. The very image that had made him a legend was now drawing eyes that didn't blink, eyes behind tinted surveillance vans and long-range lenses. Law enforcement had been watching, slowly assembling a map of his movements. Every phone call, every transaction, every murder whispered about in the shadows. It was all being documented. The myth was becoming a file, and the file was getting thick. Inside Harlem, whispers turned to warnings. Old allies began to distance themselves. Younger dealers stopped looking up to him and started plotting around him. And for all the money and muscle Alpo had gathered, he couldn't stop the one thing he feared the most: time. Time doesn't slow for kings. It circles them, patiently, waiting for the fall. One night, in a hushed conversation with a trusted associate, he spoke candidly. "The streets love you till they don't," he said, voice low and steady. "One day, they cheer your name. The next, they pray for your funeral." It wasn't fear. It was foresight. Because Alpo knew better than anyone, every empire ends. The only question was how much blood would be spilled before his did. And then, one of his closest crew members vanished. No warning. No goodbye. Just gone. People said it was over money. Others claimed he was working with the feds. Whatever the truth was, it shook Alpo to his core. Because if the people closest to him could disappear, then maybe so could he. And once that thought enters a man's mind, it never leaves. Still, he pushed forward, made more money, threw bigger parties, wore louder clothes. But each celebration felt more like a distraction, each laugh more forced. He began surrounding himself with yes-men, people too scared or too hungry to challenge him. The rooms were full, but the silence between voices grew louder. He was becoming a king in a castle of ghosts. And Harlem? Harlem was changing. The crack boom that had fed him was now consuming the neighborhoods. Families were falling apart. Children were dying in crossfire. The glamour of the game had turned to grief. And Alpo, once seen as a symbol of success, was now whispered about like a cautionary tale in motion. He didn't see it fully. Not yet. But the cracks were visible. Not just in his crew, but in his soul. The charm had worn thin. The smile became a mask. He still had money. Still had power. But he no longer had peace. One evening, while cruising down Lenox Avenue in a custom-painted drop-top, he caught a glimpse of a mural. It was of Rich Porter, smiling, immortalized in spray paint and candlelight. For a brief second, Alpo slowed down, looked, then drove off without a word. But in that moment, the silence said everything. Because Harlem might have crowned him king, but deep down, Alpo Martinez knew. Legends don't stay loved forever. And somewhere in the shadows, justice, or something colder, was beginning to move. Chapter 8. The Beginning of Betrayal. The car was parked just off the shoulder of a quiet Bronx street, headlights off, the winter night swallowing it in silence. Inside, the only light came from the pale glow of a street lamp filtering through the windshield. A man sat slouched in the front seat, his head tilted at a strange angle. Blood pooled beneath him, still warm. His mouth slightly open, as if he had been caught mid-sentence. It was the end of something. Not just a life, but a brotherhood, a legend, a city's heart. It was the body of Rich Porter. And Harlem would never be the same again. To understand that moment, the betrayal, the bullet, the bitter silence, you had to look backward, to the days when the tension was still hidden behind designer sunglasses and half-smiles. Alpo and Rich had once moved through Harlem like twin gods. One loud, magnetic, unpredictable. The other composed, respected, meticulous. They had money, power, women, and a hold over the streets that felt indestructible. But as the weight of their empire grew, so did the cracks. Tiny at first, then jagged, then lethal. Alpo had never been built for second place. Even at the top, if someone else stood beside him, it felt like a threat. And Rich? He had a calm authority that didn't need to shout. People trusted him instinctively. That quiet power gnawed at Alpo. It made him restless, suspicious. It was one thing to dominate Harlem. It was another to feel like you were sharing the throne. Whispers started, not from outsiders, but from within their own circles. Alpo believed Rich was skimming off the top, holding back on shipments, stashing profits, making silent moves. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. In Alpo's mind, loyalty had become a question mark. And in his world, doubts were more dangerous than enemies. He began planting small traps, asking about deals he'd never made, floating fake numbers, watching who repeated what. The more he searched for betrayal, the more he saw it. Even if it wasn't there, the streets felt the shift. Their once flawless operation began to fray. Meetings grew tense. Messages were delivered through intermediaries instead of face-to-face. Where there had once been trust, now there was calculation. Alpo accused. Rich denied. Neither raised their voice, but the silence between them screamed louder than words ever could. Then came the tragedy that cracked Rich's soul, the kidnapping of his younger brother, Donnell. A 12-year-old boy, full of life, taken like a pawn in a dirty game. The ransom demand was brutal, $500,000. Rich scrambled, called in favors. Alpo offered support, but the warmth was missing. Some say he looked uncomfortable. Others say he barely blinked. Days passed. Hopes dwindled. And then came the nightmare. Donnell's body found dumped like garbage off the side of a highway. A single gunshot to the head. Execution style. Harlem was stunned. The grief was raw. The city wrapped its arms around Rich, but nothing could fix the hole that had been blown through his chest. And Alpo? He disappeared into the noise. Still moving, still dealing, still building. But something in him had shifted. Or maybe it had always been there, and the mask had simply slipped. After Donald's death, Rich became quieter, more withdrawn, but not weaker. If anything, he sharpened, focused. He wanted out of the chaos, wanted to simplify, make smarter moves, maybe even leave the game altogether. But Alpo wasn't ready to let go. He felt Rich pulling away, and instead of understanding, he saw it as abandonment. Or worse, disrespect. That's when Alpo made the decision. Not in a moment of rage, but in cold calculation. He reached out to one of his shooters, someone loyal, someone who wouldn't hesitate. The plan was simple. Lure Rich out under the guise of a business meeting. Keep it quiet. No struggle. Just a clean break. And the uncertainty. And Alpo told himself it was necessary. Business. Nothing personal. On the night of the murder, Rich was last seen driving through Harlem, his car trailing behind another vehicle. People would later say he looked tired. Not scared. Just done. Like he'd finally made peace with the chaos he had once embraced. Hours later, police found his body slumped in the front seat of a black Mercedes-Benz, riddled with bullets, his pockets turned inside out to make it look like a robbery. But Harlem knew better. The news hit the streets like a seismic wave. A city that had been anesthetized by the glamour of the drug game suddenly woke up to its horror. People cried in the streets. Murals sprang up overnight. Candles lit on corners. Children wore T-shirts with Rich's face, and grown men, dealers, hustlers, killers, stood in silence, not out of fear, but respect. They had lost a prince, a brother, and the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Who could do something like this? Rumors swirled immediately. Some blamed rivals. Others pointed to dirty cops. But the name that kept surfacing, whispered in barbershops, bounced around phone lines, was Alpo. No one wanted to believe it. The two had been closer than family, had built something legendary. But in the world they lived in, legends don't die peacefully. They're taken, often by those who stood closest to them. For weeks, Alpo said nothing. No statements. No appearances. Just business as usual. But the silence didn't shield him, it exposed him. People watched how he moved, studied the gaps in his story. And though no one said it out loud, the streets reached their own verdict. Alpo had done it. Whether by his own hand or someone else's, he had betrayed Rich Porter. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was symbolic. If someone like Rich could be taken out, anyone could. Trust vanished. Crews disbanded. Paranoia replaced structure. Harlem no longer felt invincible. It felt haunted. Alpo, for all his charm and fire, could feel it too. The love was gone, replaced with suspicion, quiet stares, and half-hearted handshakes. He was still powerful, still wealthy, but he was alone in a way he had never felt before. And late at night, when the parties ended and the engines cooled, he'd sit in silence, the ghost of Rich Porter at his back, whispering every time he blinked. In a rare moment of reflection, Alpo once said, "Sometimes you make choices, and the streets never forgive you." It wasn't remorse, just recognition. He had crossed a line, and even if no badge or jury ever held him accountable, the streets already had. But what Alpo didn't know, what no one saw coming, was that the betrayal was only beginning. Because loyalty, once broken, doesn't die quietly. And somewhere, beneath the surface of his empire, revenge was beginning to breathe. Chapter 9. The Killing of Rich Porter. The Mercedes idled in the dark, engine barely whispering, headlights off. On the front seat, the tension was so thick it sucked the air out of the cabin. A city lay asleep around them, but inside that car, the clock had stopped. One man stared ahead, unaware he was seconds from death. The other sat beside him, hand on a pistol hidden in his coat, heart not pounding, but cold. It was quiet. No yelling, no warnings. Just a moment between two men who once moved as one, now sitting like strangers. And then, 3 shots. Quick, deliberate, close range. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. And just like that, Rich Porter, Harlem's prince, was gone. In the years that followed, rumors would twist the truth, and myths would blur fact. But peel back the layers, and what remained was chilling in its simplicity. Alpo Martinez murdered Rich Porter. Not in a fit of rage, not in the heat of an argument, but as a decision. A premeditated execution. Calculated. Ruthless. Final. By the time it happened, the friendship was already fractured. Rich had been pulling away, less visible in the streets, less involved in deals, more focused on stabilizing his life. The murder of his little brother had gutted him, drained the fire from his eyes. Harlem had changed, and Rich, once proud to rule it, seemed ready to leave it behind. Alpo, on the other hand, was still on the gas pedal. He saw Rich's retreat not as grief, but as weakness. And worse, he suspected betrayal. Money had gone missing. Deals were unaccounted for. Alpo heard whispers from his crew. Maybe Rich was moving behind his back, setting up a separate network, preparing to exit and take the crown with him. Whether any of it was true didn't matter. In the drug game, perception is reality. And once Alpo perceived Rich as a liability, the clock started ticking. The night it happened, Alpo invited Rich out under the pretense of talking business. It wasn't unusual. Despite the friction, they still shared mutual contacts, mutual risks. Rich agreed. Maybe out of habit. Maybe because he trusted that no matter how cold things had become, Alpo wouldn't cross that final line. That trust was his mistake. The meeting location changed last minute. Alpo said it'd be quiet, just a quick ride to go over numbers. Rich slid into the passenger seat, wearing a bomber jacket, gold chain tucked beneath his collar. He looked tired, worn, like a man trying to finish something that had already unraveled. What happened inside that car wasn't loud. It wasn't messy. Alpo waited until they were on a quiet stretch of road. Then, without raising his voice, without warning, he pulled the gun and fired. One shot to the head, then another, then a final one to the chest. Rich slumped against the door, lifeless. His eyes open, his chain still glinting in the dim light. There were no screams, no struggle, just silence, and then the eerie hum of the car engine, still running. Alpo didn't panic. He didn't cry. He didn't hesitate. He drove to a desolate area near Orchard Beach and dumped the body on the side of the road. He opened the door, rolled Rich's body out like it was trash, and drove away without looking back. Hours later, the police would find the car. Doors ajar, blood splattered, Rich's body cooling in the early morning frost. The news hit Harlem like a thunderclap. People didn't want to believe it. Couldn't. Rich Porter wasn't just a dealer. He was a symbol, a brother, a mentor, a legend. To many, he had walked the tightrope of the game with integrity. He'd taken care of his people, stayed loyal, played it smart. His death felt like the rules had been rewritten. If someone like Rich could be taken out, no one was safe. The streets erupted in speculation. Who could do this? Why? Some blamed rivals. Others blamed law enforcement. But quietly, the real answer moved through Harlem like smoke. Alpo. No one said it aloud, not at first. To accuse Alpo was to invite death. But the way he carried himself in the days that followed, it didn't help. He didn't grieve. He didn't retreat. He kept moving, flashing, partying, as if nothing had happened. People noticed. The respect that had once surrounded him like armor began to corrode. You don't kill your brother. You don't take out the man who built with you, bled with you, and washed your back when the whole world was hunting you. Not unless something inside you has turned to stone. And for Alpo, it had. He would later admit to the murder. Years later, under federal protection, in the safety of confession, he would lay it bare. Said Rich was going behind his back. Said it was business. Said he had no choice. But those words rang hollow. Because everyone knew, Alpo always had a choice. And he chose betrayal. What haunted Harlem wasn't just the killing, it was what it meant. The drug game had always been violent. But this was different. This was surgical, strategic. A betrayal not born of survival, but ambition. Alpo had sent a message, not just to Rich, but to everyone. No one is untouchable. No bond is sacred. The crown comes with a body count, and he was willing to pay the toll. In the months that followed, Harlem changed. Crews fell apart. Alliances shifted. Young hustlers who once dreamed of being like Alpo now feared becoming his next example. And as federal pressure began to close in, surveillance, indictments, raids, people started talking. Quietly, carefully, but they talked. About the murder, about the deals, about the man who had once been Harlem's king and now moved through it like a ghost. Alpo had crossed the one line that mattered most. And while he was still free, still spending money, still flashing smiles, the walls were beginning to close in. The feds were watching. The streets were turning. And the legend was starting to rot. He had built an empire, killed his partner, and now, every move he made echoed with the sound of his own footsteps, hunted, hollow, and alone. Because you can murder a man, but you can't bury a ghost. Chapter 10, DC Bloodshed. The body hit the ground before the echo of the gunshot even finished bouncing off the alley walls. It was a cold, calculated kill, clean, quiet, and forgotten by sunrise. In Washington, D.C., death came often, but this one was different. The man lying lifeless in a pool of his own blood hadn't just crossed the wrong dealer. He'd crossed Alpo Martinez. And in D.C., that mistake was always fatal. Word spread quick, faster than sirens, faster than fear. The Harlem Flash had arrived in the nation's capital, and he wasn't interested in negotiations. He came to dominate. And one by one, the city's dealers began to disappear. Alpo's move to D.C. wasn't exile, it was expansion. After Harlem started to feel too hot, too heavy with suspicion and whispers after Rich's murder, Alpo saw opportunity in the chaos of a city already drowning in blood. Washington, D.C., in the late 1980s wasn't politics and monuments. It was open turf. Crack cocaine had wrapped its fingers around entire neighborhoods, turning corners into war zones. Bodies were dropping. Crews were forming and folding in a single week, and federal eyes hadn't fully figured out what they were looking at yet. To Alpo, it looked like fresh snow ready to leave footprints in. He didn't arrive timidly. He didn't sneak in. Alpo rolled through D.C. the same way he had ruled Harlem, with charisma, boldness, and firepower. Bright cars, louder clothes, piles of money. But beneath the surface charm was a man shaped by paranoia, fueled by ambition, and surrounded by silence, his own kind of code. He spoke sweetly, laughed easily, even cracked jokes with cops when he had to. But when it came time to make a move, his eyes went hollow, like he flipped a switch and disappeared behind them. He started by aligning with local dealers, not as a partner, but as a predator in disguise. He learned their operations, studied their weaknesses, and then moved to take over. Some folded willingly, seduced by the size of his operation, the luxury he offered. Others refused. They didn't last long. One by one, Alpo cleared the board. It was chess, not checkers. And he didn't mind sacrificing pawns to corner the king. Soon, D.C. started to look familiar, like Harlem in its golden era. Blocks answered to Alpo. Runners wore his colors. Money flowed. But with it came murder. Quiet ones. Brutal ones. Disappearances that left mothers searching and rivals too scared to ask questions. Alpo didn't just remove threats, he erased them. If someone spoke out of turn, skimmed too much, or even looked uncertain, they vanished. And no one dared whisper his name in connection. One of his closest men, someone once considered family, made the mistake of questioning a call. The next night, that man's car was found burning on the edge of town. His body inside, too charred to identify by anything but dental records. Alpo didn't blink. He said it was a lesson. In his world, fear was currency, and he spent it generously. But what made Alpo truly dangerous wasn't just his appetite for power. It was the duality he carried. He could walk into a room and light it up with laughter, charm a room full of strangers, dance with a woman, then step outside and order a hit like he was choosing dinner. The switch was terrifying. And for those in his circle, it kept them guessing. They loved him. They feared him. Sometimes, they didn't know which came first. He kept his crew tight. Harlem loyalists who'd followed him south, trusted shooters, and lieutenants who would take a bullet without asking why. But even among them, trust was limited. Alpo fed them well, dressed them better, but watched them constantly. Everyone had a shelf life. Everyone was expendable. It wasn't paranoia, it was policy. Law enforcement, still tangled in bureaucratic confusion, hadn't yet realized that this one man from Harlem was now behind some of the most organized, violent drug operations in the district. Bodies piled up, But the lines between local turf wars and Alpo's expanding influence were still blurry. That was his advantage. He used the chaos like camouflage, slipping through raids, flipping witnesses before they could speak, bribing cops when needed, and ghosting out of scenes like he was never there. One night, a dealer who'd been ducking payments was found duct-taped in a basement, knees shattered, mouth sewn shut with fishing line. It wasn't about the money. Alpo had lost more than that on a bad dice roll. It was about the principle, the warning. That scene wasn't just punishment, it was theater. Word of it spread faster than the murder itself. People knew who was behind it. They just didn't say it out loud. Because in D.C., saying Alpo's name was like calling on a curse. Still, beneath the bloodshed and dominance, the foundation was cracking. Violence creates noise. And Alpo was no longer the shadow he once was. His lifestyle drew attention. His past haunted him. And in D.C., the game was changing fast. The FBI had shifted its focus. Federal drug task forces began linking murders to turf disputes. Informants, desperate for lighter sentences, started to drop hints. No names, yet, but stories. Stories about a Harlem man with a silver tongue and a dead-eye stare. Inside his circle, things grew colder. One of his lieutenants began moving strange, taking meetings Alpo hadn't approved, flashing money from side deals. Alpo invited him to dinner. It was quiet. They laughed, ordered dessert. By midnight, the man was dead, shot twice in the back while leaving the restaurant. Alpo didn't wait for the body to cool. He paid the tab and left, smiling. And yet, that smile was beginning to crack. He knew the clock was ticking. The paranoia sharpened. He started driving with 3 cars instead of 1. Switched phones daily. Slept in hotels under false names. The tighter he gripped D.C., the more it tried to slip away. Old allies began questioning if the blood was worth it. Younger dealers grew bolder, angrier, seeing Alpo as a relic of the past, not a path to the future. He tried to rebuild trust through generosity. Bought his crew new chains. Paid hospital bills for mothers. Threw wild parties. But underneath it all was a man trying to stay ahead of the storm. He could feel it brewing. In the way people looked at him. In the silence that followed his name. The charm no longer worked the way it used to. Some smiled back at him, but their eyes didn't. Then came the killing that would change everything. A high-ranking D.C. dealer, deeply connected and deeply feared, was found murdered execution style behind a warehouse. No money taken. No drugs missing. Just a clean kill, professional. The city exploded. That man wasn't just connected to crews. He had links to politicians, police, and power. Killing him was like setting fire to a hornet's nest. And for the first time, Alpo felt the pressure. Real pressure. The kind that didn't come from the streets, but from rooms where badges and warrants were drawn like weapons. The feds were now watching. Listening. Moving in. Slowly. Methodically. And Alpo, for all his smarts and ruthlessness, knew the game was shifting. He still played the part. Still showed up at clubs in furs, with girls on both arms. Still tipped waiters with $100 bills and left in roaring engines. But the eyes in the shadows were different now. Sharper. Patient. The violence he'd once used as a tool had become a spotlight. And there was no turning it off. The blood he spilled in D.C. had bought him power. Fear. Respect. But it had also painted a target on his back the size of a city. And somewhere, behind a two-way mirror, a federal agent leaned forward and whispered, "We've got him." Chapter 11. Alpo's Code of Violence. He always smiled before the kill. Not a wide grin. Not madness. Just a slight, calm curve of the lips. As if he were settling a quiet score with the universe. That smile was the last thing some of his closest associates ever saw. For Alpo Martinez, murder wasn't just a means to an end. It was a ritual. A message. A signature written in gunpowder. And each time he pulled the trigger or gave the nod, he believed he was restoring balance in a world where loyalty was a currency constantly devaluing. Michael Frey was no small name. In the D.C. underworld, he was respected, connected, calculated, with roots in the very streets Alpo was trying to conquer. They were partners, sort of. At least, that's what Frey thought. But in Alpo's world, there were no equals. Only soldiers and threats. And Frey, smart, rising, independent, was beginning to look more and more like the latter. He'd started questioning Alpo's decisions, challenging calls, suggesting other routes for product. To Frey, it was business. To Alpo, it was treason. They had a meeting in a quiet part of town. No muscle, just words. That's how Frey preferred it. Civil, clean. But Alpo came with something else under the surface. A coldness that didn't match his voice. Mid-conversation, as Frey leaned forward to make a point, Alpo pulled the trigger. Twice. Point blank. The sound didn't even echo, just sank into the walls like a secret. He watched Frey drop to the ground, still mid-thought, a look of confusion frozen on his face. That was Alpo's message. You don't question the throne when the king still breathes. The body was left out in the open. Not hidden. Not discarded. That was intentional. Alpo wanted DC to see. Wanted Harlem to feel it. He wasn't just building an empire. He was writing a doctrine. And the first rule was clear. Loyalty was owed, not earned. The second? Disrespect was fatal. What made Alpo terrifying wasn't just that he killed. It was who he killed and how close they were to him. Associates. Friends. People who'd eaten with him, bled with him, called him brother. His violence wasn't wild or reactionary. It was disciplined, strategic, chillingly intimate. Like a lion that doesn't roar until your throat's already in its mouth. He kept a mental list. Not of enemies, but of behaviors. Signs. A voice that trembled during a deal. Eyes that darted too often in a room. A hesitation when asked to ride out. Alpo didn't wait for betrayal. He anticipated it. And if he suspected even a flicker of doubt in someone's loyalty, he'd act. Sometimes it was a test. Other times, a bullet. But one way or another, the threat was neutralized. Another murder followed soon after. A runner, young, eager, loyal, but careless. Word got back that he was bragging, flashing product too publicly, drawing attention to operations. Alpo called him in, told him to relax, offered him a drink, said he was proud of how far he'd come. Then, while the kid was laughing at a joke, Alpo had one of his shooters put 2 rounds in the back of his head. The lesson wasn't for the dead, it was for the living. Discipline wasn't optional, and trust had a lifespan. Even his own Harlem guys started feeling the weight. They had come with him to DC expecting fast money, faster women, and street glory. What they found instead was a regime built on paranoia and power plays. Alpo didn't lead through inspiration. He led through tension. His presence in a room froze conversations. One wrong glance, one mistimed joke, and your name might end up on his quiet kill list. But Alpo didn't see it as cruelty. In his mind, he was keeping order. When you build an empire out of powder and fear, you don't run it like a business. You run it like a battlefield. Everyone's a potential traitor. Every friend is a future headline. The only way to stay alive is to move faster than the betrayal and kill before it has time to speak. Still, cracks began to form in the silence. People whispered. People wondered. How long before he turned on all of them? The violence wasn't just targeted anymore. It was atmospheric. It lingered in conversations, crept into smiles, colored every handshake. The crew that once moved as one began to drift. Loyalty no longer felt like honor. It felt like survival. Law enforcement began piecing things together. Names, bodies, patterns. The killings weren't just turf-related. They were surgical, strategic eliminations of potential liabilities. Snitches, hotheads, rivals who got too close. One detective described it as watching someone clean house before the storm hit. They didn't know exactly who was behind it yet, but the trail was dark and soaked in blood. And at its center, there was always one name, Alpo. There was one associate in particular who saw it coming. He had been close to Alpo, handled drops, moved money, sat in rooms where lives were decided. But he also saw the shift. The moment Alpo stopped trusting the air he breathed, he started sleeping with a gun on his chest, one eye open. He began writing down every conversation he had, like leaving a breadcrumb trail for someone, in case he vanished. And then one day he did. His apartment was left untouched. Wallet still there. Car parked neatly. But he was gone. Some said he fled. Others swore Alpo had him buried in concrete somewhere along the Beltway. Either way, He became another ghost in the growing gallery of those who stood too close to Alpo Martinez. And yet, even as bodies dropped and alliances crumbled, Alpo didn't slow down. If anything, he moved faster. The violence gave him momentum. In his eyes, it cleared the noise. Every kill simplified his world, made the circle smaller, more controlled, and he told himself it was necessary. That kings don't ask for loyalty, they demand it. That fear was stronger than love. But fear doesn't build legacies, and it doesn't silence ghosts. Behind him, a trail of unfinished stories whispered his name. Mothers, brothers, friends, each with a wound they couldn't explain, a loss that made no sense. And the streets, once hypnotized by his charisma, were beginning to recoil. The charm that once opened doors now felt dangerous. The smile that once disarmed rivals now came with blood on its breath. Alpo wasn't just a dealer anymore. He was a specter, a man who had carved out his kingdom with hollow point reminders that in his world, silence wasn't golden, it was survival. But violence, no matter how controlled, always leaves a trace. And with each murder, Alpo wasn't just controlling his world. He was tightening a noose he couldn't yet see. Because somewhere, across the river, someone was keeping score. And they weren't planning to knock. They were planning to take it all. Chapter 12. Business is booming. The money moved faster than bullets. It came in bricks, not bills, stacked, packed, and dripping with blood. Every sunrise, Alpo Martinez's operation stretched wider, louder, richer. Harlem, Washington, D.C., Baltimore. Entire cities were stitched together under his name like a stitched-up Frankenstein empire. Part charm, part fear, and all built on the back of crack cocaine. It wasn't a business anymore. It was a machine. And at the center of it stood a man who smiled like a celebrity and struck like a guillotine. He wore his power like a second skin. At nightclubs, Alpo didn't walk in, he arrived. Champagne flowed before he even waved a hand. Girls leaned in before he spoke. Doormen moved like shadows to clear his path. And yet, beneath the diamonds, the cars, the velvet ropes, he was never relaxed. The way his eyes scanned the room told the real story. He wasn't there for celebration. He was taking inventory. Who was watching? Who was whispering? Who might need to be dealt with before they made the mistake of thinking they could challenge the throne? The drug game, by now, had evolved beyond corners and hand-to-hands. Alpo had transformed it into an inner-city pipeline. Harlem was still home base, but D.C. had become his fortress. Couriers moved product in rental cars, trucks, and even hidden inside children's toys. Cash came back stuffed in duffel bags, sometimes still warm from being vacuum-sealed in hotel rooms. He didn't just flood the streets. He irrigated them. And the neighborhoods that once ignored his rise now depended on his empire to survive. Every week meant millions. Every day brought new risks. Yet Alpo carried it all with the reckless confidence of a man convinced that gravity didn't apply to him. There were no ledgers, no accountants, just memory and muscle. Loyalty was measured in silence and obedience. If you moved right, he made you rich. If you slipped up, he made you disappear. The crew had seen it too many times to doubt it. Alpo wasn't asking to be followed. He was demanding it. He ran his crew like a general, but he sold himself like a movie star. That blend of lethal charisma made him unpredictable. To the streets, he was half villain, half icon. The kids idolized his style. The dealers envied his pull. The women romanticized the danger in his smile. And the men who tried to rival him usually didn't get a second attempt. Even police, when they crossed his path in casual stops or street interactions, felt the weight of his name. Some looked the other way. Others tried to play smart. But everyone knew who they were dealing with. You didn't just arrest Alpo Martinez. You built a case around him like you were wiring explosives, slow, steady, and careful not to trip the wrong wire. Still, he wasn't reckless without reason. Every move was a message. Every execution served a purpose. If a low-level dealer ran off with product, Alpo didn't just take him out. He'd leave the body in a visible place. A trash bin behind a barber shop. An alley near a playground. Somewhere public. Not for the police, but for the people. He wanted the lesson to echo. Respect the hierarchy or vanish from it. But what terrified most wasn't the murders. It was how easily he switched faces. In the same day, Alpo could attend a christening in a custom suit, kiss a baby, shake a preacher's hand, and then hours later, orchestrate a killing like it was a dinner reservation. His ability to blend, to charm, to move through chaos like he was born in it, made him almost mythological. People didn't know whether to fear him or follow him. Most did both. At one point, his cash flow grew so large, he stopped counting it. Counting became a waste of time. Instead, he weighed the duffel bags. If it wasn't heavy enough, the deal was light. He'd send the courier back without saying a word. That kind of scale didn't just happen, it had to be enforced. And he enforced it with a smile and a .45. Still, the empire was beginning to shift beneath his feet. He didn't see it fully, not yet, but the patterns were there, in the nervous tones of his crew, in the hesitations when he barked an order, in the silence that followed him like smoke. Power is magnetic, but it's also corrosive. And for all his street genius, Alpo was still playing a game with no end, only traps. One of those traps came wrapped in admiration. A rising dealer in D.C., young, flashy, eager to impress, began mimicking Alpo's moves. Dressing like him, talking like him, trying to build his own lane, too close to the source. At first, Alpo laughed it off, called it cute. But envy in the drug world is a cancer that spreads fast. When the kid started recruiting from his crew, offering better percentages, Alpo saw it for what it was, the beginning of a mutiny. The kid's body was found with his mouth duct-taped and his hands broken, one for each runner he stole. It wasn't about punishment. It was about precedent. Violence, for Alpo, had become routine. Like a mechanic reaching for a wrench, he reached for guns and goons. But he never got his hands too dirty. He had layers now, trusted hitters, hardened soldiers, men who do the work with clean gloves and unflinching eyes. Still, when it mattered, when the betrayal was personal, he made sure to be close. Watching, studying, making sure the lesson landed. And yet, there were moments, rare and fleeting, when the mask slipped, when the king seemed tired. In the quiet hours after a long night, in the back of a club with the music down low, when his closest circle had cleared out and only the smoke remained, Alpo would sit back in the shadows, a glass in hand, and his eyes would lose that fire. He'd stare into nothing for a few seconds, like some ghost from Harlem was whispering into his ear. Regret? Maybe. Or maybe just the weight of everything he'd built and everything he'd buried to keep it standing. But those moments never lasted. The streets wouldn't allow it. A king doesn't mourn in public. A king keeps moving. The DEA was already circling. Slowly, silently, building profiles, connecting bodies, cross-referencing surveillance from New York to D.C. They were patient. They knew he was smart. But they also knew his flaw. He believed he was invincible. And that belief made him reckless in small ways. Phone calls that weren't scrambled. Runners who got caught and talked too much. Paper trails left in backroom deals when he should have stayed clean. He was slipping, but only slightly. Enough to open a door. By now, his operation stretched across multiple states, worth tens of millions. And yet, there was no boardroom. No corporate structure. It was all muscle and memory. He trusted no one with paperwork. No accountants. No books. Just his word, and the understanding that disloyalty came with the tombstone. Even his Harlem days felt distant now, like a different life. Rich Porter, the money, the glamour, it all seemed like a prologue to something darker. Alpo had evolved, hardened. He no longer needed to be liked, only feared. The charisma remained, but it was hollow. A performance, not a personality. And still business boomed. The streets kept buying. Addicts lined up like clockwork. Neighborhoods bled and begged and paid. His name, whispered or shouted, meant something. It meant product. It meant punishment. It meant power. But somewhere in the system he'd built, deep in its foundation, was a crack. Invisible for now, but growing. Because no empire built on fear survives forever. And the louder the money grew, the closer the silence came. Chapter 13, Paranoia and Pressure. It started with a whisper, then a pause, then a second glance across the room that lingered too long. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. But for Alpo Martinez, whose survival depended on reading the tiniest shifts in energy, it meant everything. In the drug world, betrayal didn't always shout. Sometimes, it just stared at you too long before answering a question, or made a phone call in the bathroom, or smiled a second too late. And Alpo felt it in his bones. The warmth around him was starting to rot. By now, he was rich beyond measure. His cars formed a fleet. His jewelry screamed louder than his enemies. His reputation reached further than the cities he ruled. But with power came pressure. And the higher he climbed, the thinner the air got. People were watching everywhere. Not just the streets. Not just rivals. But law enforcement, moving in slow, silent waves, patient as predators. They weren't knocking yet. But Alpo could feel the wind change. He stopped sleeping the way he used to. Even in luxury hotel suites, even surrounded by loyal soldiers, he began keeping one eye open. A gun on the nightstand. A backup piece under the pillow. And a third one taped under the sink, just in case. He'd pace the room long after everyone had passed out drunk or high, looking out the windows, watching the horizon like something was coming for him. Something invisible and closing fast. Conversations with his crew grew shorter. He stopped trusting the laughter, stopped believing the loyalty. He started switching up locations last minute, carrying out meetings in cars, diners, even parking garages. It wasn't about staying ahead anymore. It was about staying alive. And nothing breeds carelessness faster than desperation. The paranoia wasn't baseless. The walls were closing in. Informants had begun talking. Some arrested runners, scared out of their minds, flipped for lighter sentences. Others were enemies pretending to be friends, trading crumbs of information in back rooms with agents who were slowly building a web around him. The feds didn't want just another bust. They wanted the whole house to collapse. And Alpo, for all his calculation, had made enemies too fast to count. Inside the empire, cracks were forming. Small, almost invisible, like a glass under pressure. Men who once followed orders without question now hesitated. They double-checked directions. Asked why. That was all it took to make Alpo suspicious. He began recording conversations without saying a word. He started planting false information just to see who repeated it. If word came back, he knew who couldn't be trusted. And when he found them, he didn't yell. He didn't argue. He'd call them in, smile, offer a drink, and then have them shot. Quiet, quick, clinical. But for every body that dropped, the silence around him deepened. He was thinning his herd too fast, burning bridges before the next one was even built. DC had become hostile. Harlem didn't feel like home. Every friend now looked like a future problem. Even the people closest to him, the ones who had been there since the beginning, started noticing the shift. The joke stopped. The charm faded. What remained was a man wound too tight, who saw betrayal in every shadow. He started wearing body armor under his designer clothes. Wouldn't sit with his back to the door, even in places he controlled. He tested his food, watched who handled his money. At one point, he even made one of his drivers pull over, take off his shoes, and empty his pockets, convinced he had a wire. The man was clean. Still, Alpo never let him drive again. Loyalty, once assumed, now had to be proven daily. And even then, it wasn't enough. Behind the scenes, the DEA was putting together the pieces. Wiretaps, flipped co-defendants, surveillance logs. The agents working the case weren't in a rush. They understood what they were hunting. A kingpin who moved like smoke and smiled like a movie star. So they waited. Let him get comfortable. Let him dig his own grave, one careless move at a time. And the moves were getting careless. He began traveling without full protection, making deals in places he never used to, arguing in public with rivals, showing up at clubs with fewer guards, more women, and too much liquor in his system. The paranoia was taking a toll, turning instinct into impulse. He didn't just fear betrayal, he expected it. That expectation made him lash out at people who hadn't even crossed him yet. One night in DC, during a late-night drop gone wrong, he lost his temper on one of his own men. Thought he was being shorted, pulled out a gun, screamed in front of witnesses. The product was clean. The money was right. But Alpo fired anyway, one shot to the chest. Left the body behind. walked away like nothing happened. No cleanup, no logic, just rage. That night was different. That night, people didn't see a boss. They saw a man unraveling. He could feel the heat rising. The streets were talking. People were disappearing. And in the distance, that slow grind of law enforcement pressure was starting to feel like a vice around his ribs. He changed phone numbers weekly, used lookouts even for simple errands. But the mistakes kept stacking. One of the biggest came from trust. What little of it he had left. A new associate he believed was solid turned out to be compromised. The man had been approached by the feds months earlier, threatened with charges, shown photos of dead bodies, given a choice: cooperate or become one of the pictures. He chose survival, and every meeting he had with Alpo after that was recorded. Slowly, details began leaking. Where product was stored, who the main couriers were, times, dates, faces. The kind of intel that turned suspicion into a warrant. And Alpo had no idea. He still smiled at the man, still let him into the inner circle, still spoke freely, never knowing each sentence was stitching together the case that would bring him down. Meanwhile, rivals had begun circling like vultures. Some wanted revenge for lost territory. Others wanted blood for fallen friends. But most just wanted what Alpo had: the money, the power, the legend. His paranoia made it hard to tell friend from foe. He'd once said the only man you could truly trust was one already buried. And now, that philosophy became his routine. Every new connection was treated as a threat. Every old one was subject to review. The spiral was tightening. He stopped moving like a boss and started moving like a fugitive. Less control, more reaction, more guns, fewer allies. There were moments he'd stare at himself in the mirror, running fingers across the gold around his neck, wondering if it was worth it, wondering if he could walk away. But he knew better. In this world, there was no retirement plan. You didn't get to fade out. You got caught, or you got killed. One day, he walked into a restaurant and noticed two unfamiliar faces in the back. Clean cut, not from the neighborhood. They looked down when he looked at them. That was the moment it hit him. He wasn't being hunted anymore. He was surrounded. The whispers were real. The pressure wasn't paranoia. And the next mistake wouldn't just cost him his empire. It would cost him everything. Still, he kept moving. He had always believed that speed beat surveillance. That staying unpredictable kept him alive. But unpredictability is a double-edged sword. When you're always in motion, the people chasing you just need to follow the pattern of your chaos. And the feds had enough now. Enough voices. Enough footage. Enough fear-based witnesses ready to testify, all echoing one truth. Alpo Martinez was running out of time. What he didn't know was how close it had already gotten. A sealed indictment. A coordinated raid. A federal agent with a file thicker than his rap sheet. And someone, maybe more than one, very close to him, already wearing a wire. The kingpin was still standing. But the kingdom was cracking. And the fall wasn't a question anymore. It was a countdown. Chapter 14, The Fall Begins. It didn't start with a siren. It didn't come crashing through the door with a battering ram or a squad of agents in windbreakers. The beginning of Alpo Martinez's downfall came in silence. In the quiet click of a tape recorder. In the careful nod between an informant and a federal handler. In the shifting tone of a street soldier's voice when asked a simple question. It came in whispers, in paperwork, in black vans parked just a little too long outside apartment buildings. The noose didn't yank. It tightened, slowly, methodically, until even the air around him grew thinner. For months, federal agents had watched from the shadows. Unmarked vehicles followed his runners across borough lines. Helicopters with night vision optics circled above known stash houses. Phones once considered clean were now lines to building evidence. They were listening, watching, waiting. This wasn't a drug bust. This was a takedown. The kind of operation you plan like war, strategic, quiet, and devastating when it finally struck. The key wasn't just surveillance. It was infiltration. Informants, some Alpo knew, some he didn't, had been flipped. Caught with weight, or with dead friends tied to their names, they were given a choice. Serve decades in a cage, or give up the man who had ruled them like a god. And one by one, they talked. Each one gave the feds another puzzle piece. Locations, times, Murders. Names. Bodies that had no justice were suddenly being mapped to a voice behind closed doors. The stories all pointed in one direction, and they were all starting to align. Alpo still moved with confidence, but his paranoia had grown roots. He began noticing things. A package delayed by an extra hour. A new face hanging too close on a street corner. He'd grown used to fear, used to watching his back, but this was different. It wasn't fear of rivals anymore. It was the growing suspicion that the law was closer than he thought. But even with his instincts screaming, he couldn't see how close they truly were. Every call he made, every conversation, every meeting, it was all being logged. His words, once currency in the streets, were now evidence. Agents knew his rhythms. They knew when he liked to move product, what time his cars left the safe houses, where his soldiers rotated shifts. It was like watching a machine run itself. But no machine is perfect. And Alpo, for all his charisma and brutality, had gotten sloppy. He'd gotten used to winning, used to people flinching before him, used to streets whispering his name with awe, not contempt. That comfort gave birth to small mistakes. He stopped vetting new members as tightly. He let his temper flare more easily. He gave orders in public places, assuming fear alone would keep mouths shut. But fear doesn't hold forever. Not when the feds offer protection and a way out. Not when old soldiers start calculating risk and realize that silence now means a life sentence later. One of his lieutenants, quiet, loyal, and trusted, was the first domino. Caught on a gun charge, facing time he couldn't stomach. He didn't flip right away. He waited. Thought Alpo would bail him out. But the help never came. Alpo had already written him off. Said he was a liability. So when the feds offered him a deal, he didn't hesitate. He gave them his route maps, his burner phone logs, his stash house locations, and most importantly, his trust. That was the first leak. Then came others. Another courier, a woman he once slept with, turned state's evidence. A third-tier supplier caught in a DEA sting gave updates, locations, and a list of names with X's next to the ones who were expendable. Piece by piece, the agents weren't just watching, they were building. Indictments were drafted. Prosecutors sharpened timelines. And the trap wasn't tightening, it was complete. All that remained was when to spring it. Alpo began to feel the heat, but couldn't identify its source. He started rotating homes nightly. Used payphones like it was the 70s. Had his crew follow his own cars to make sure no one tailed him. But the truth was, it wasn't the people behind him he needed to fear, it was the ones beside him. The ones still shaking his hand. Still laughing at his jokes. Still saying, "We got you." Even as their conversations were being played back in federal conference rooms on loop. There was a meeting, deep in the Bronx, where everything should have felt secure. Private room. Doors locked. 3 of his closest men. Alpo sat at the head of the table, eyes darting, smile crooked, trying to pretend everything was fine. But one of those men had a wire strapped to his chest. As Alpo laid out his new plan, how to expand further into Jersey, how to move the next shipment undetected, he had no idea that every word was being transcribed in real time. Later, that transcript would become part of a sealed indictment. A timeline of events that federal prosecutors would later describe as one of the clearest roadmaps to a kingpin's operation ever documented. They had him. On tape. In voice. With witnesses to verify. They even had photos, him sitting with rival bosses, with known murder suspects, even with dirty cops who would later lose their shields and stand trial themselves. Still, the takedown had to be perfect. The feds didn't just want him arrested, they wanted him stunned. They wanted the myth to shatter. So they waited for just the right moment. Watched as he moved freely, unaware that the very air around him had turned poisonous. That every smile was a setup. Every familiar voice a liability. And the empire he'd built with fear was now being dismantled with patience. The final days before his arrest were quiet. Too quiet. That's when even Alpo started to feel it deep in his gut, that something was off. Too many unreturned calls. Too many dead ends. He drove through Harlem one night and noticed a car behind him that hadn't been there a block before. Changed lanes. It followed. Turned corners. Still there. When he finally lost it, he sat alone in his apartment, sweat beading on his neck, realizing what the streets already knew. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. He tried to call one of his connects. No answer. Another, voicemail. A third number said the line was disconnected. The silence was deafening. The web had closed. And by the time he thought to run, the boots were already hitting the pavement outside. Lights out. Door kicked. Flashlights. Guns drawn. Screams. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, like a surgeon making an incision. They didn't ask questions. They read rights. They cuffed him, and the kingpin fell with no crown and no warning. The empire didn't collapse like a bomb. It dissolved like acid. Runners disappeared. Crews scattered. Stash houses were burned or abandoned. Safe money got buried or lost. And the people who once called him boss now called their lawyers. Alpo was gone, just like that. But the story wasn't over. Because in the darkness of a cold federal cell, a new decision waited. One that would redefine everything he'd ever built, and everything he was about to destroy. Chapter 15, The Arrest. It was November of 1991 when the weight of a kingdom built on blood and betrayal finally came crashing down. But there were no crowds. No screaming headlines at that moment. No last-minute gunfight or dramatic foot chase through the streets of Harlem. Just a soft knock. A command to open the door. And the slow realization that the man who once walked with impunity through 2 cities was now nothing more than a suspect in chains. The fall didn't come with fire. It came with cold metal and dead silence. In those final hours of freedom, Alpo Martinez was pacing in a room that no longer felt like a fortress. The energy was wrong. It had been wrong for days. Too many calls going unanswered. Too many allies gone quiet. Too many cars parked just a little too long on the curb. He could feel it in his chest. Not fear. Not yet. Just a deep, nagging awareness that the clock had finally run out. Then came the door. A knock. Firm, precise, practiced. The kind that doesn't ask. It demands. By the time he turned toward it, it was already opening. The hinges split the room like a razor, and through it came federal agents in bulletproof vests. Their expressions didn't change. They didn't need to shout. Everything had already been decided. Alpo didn't resist. He didn't run. He just stood there, staring back at the life he'd carved for himself. One last time, before the cuffs snapped tight and the illusion of invincibility shattered. The headlines would come later. Harlem drug kingpin captured. Federal sting ends Alpo's reign. But inside that room, it was quiet. The silence of defeat. The silence of every ghost he'd made, whispering back at him through the cuffs. As they led him down the stairs and into the van, the flash of red and blue lights washed across his face. For the first time in years, there was no applause. No envy. No fear in the eyes of those watching. Only the grim satisfaction of a story finally catching up to its narrator. Alpo was taken to a holding cell in Manhattan. Gray walls. Fluorescent lights that buzzed like broken memories. The air smelled of bleach and sweat and justice long delayed. There were no luxury chairs here. No leather seats. No champagne on ice. Just a hard bench and the cold echo of his own thoughts bouncing off concrete. The charges read like a horror novel. Multiple counts of murder. Conspiracy to distribute massive amounts of cocaine. Weapons violations. RICO enhancements. The indictment was thick, built over months of surveillance, wiretaps, and witness statements. Names he trusted now lined the margins of federal paperwork. His crew, his partners, even his friends. Their testimonies didn't just accuse, they outlined. Every drop, every hit, every betrayal. The feds weren't here to negotiate. They were here to bury him. The courtroom, when he was finally brought in, buzzed with anticipation. Reporters scribbled in notepads. Courtroom artists sketched the man whose legend had haunted Harlem like a ghost with gold chains. Prosecutors read the charges with surgical precision. Alpo sat still, dressed in standard-issue beige, his eyes scanning the room. Not for sympathy, but for loyalty. What he found instead was absence. No soldiers. No lovers. No old friends in the back row. Just the sound of chains brushing tile and the steady drum of a gavel calling him to account. The evidence was overwhelming. They had tapes, testimony, forensics, crime scene matches, witnesses in protective custody. Even family members of his victims were ready to speak. The trial hadn't started yet, but the weight of it loomed like an avalanche. Everyone in that room could feel it. For all his charisma, all his charm, Alpo Martinez had finally run out of corners to turn. And now, the only path ahead led to a cell. The hardest thing wasn't the cell itself. It was the quiet. The long, endless stretches of silence broken only by the occasional rattle of keys or the bark of a guard. In those moments, stripped of distraction, he had to live with the memories, the faces, the friends he'd lost, the ones he'd buried, the ones he'd betrayed. Some nights he sat up on the edge of his cot, hands locked, eyes open, like he was still plotting, but there was no empire left to save. Still, part of him refused to believe it was over. Not because he didn't understand the charges, but because he couldn't accept that his life, once so powerful, so infamous, could end in a box. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's story unfold. He was the man who ran Harlem, who conquered D.C., who ordered hits like chess moves. And now, a guard called him by a number, not a name. But reality is cruel in its clarity. He was facing life. No parole, no deals. Not this time. The prosecution wanted to make an example of him, show the next generation of drug lords what the final chapter looked like. Cold, forgotten, locked in a cinder-block tomb where no money, no legend could reach. Back in the unit, Alpo received his discovery packet. Hundreds of pages, black ink on white paper, each sentence a nail in the coffin. As he flipped through the files, he recognized the names, the dates, the details only someone on the inside could know. That's when it hit him. The betrayal wasn't just strategic. It was personal. People he'd fed, protected, promoted, now turned around and handed him over in pieces. He didn't cry. Not then. Not later. But the silence around him grew heavier, like a ghost pressing down on his chest. The man known for his smile, for his gold chains and wild confidence, now sat slumped in a chair, reading the end of his story one page at a time. This wasn't how he pictured it. And yet, deep down, maybe he always knew. Maybe every violent move, every lie, every shot fired in Paranoia was just another step toward this. Outside, the streets were talking. Some cheered. Others whispered. The myth had fallen. Harlem's prince, DC's killer, the man with 9 lives and a platinum tongue, was just another inmate now. The young ones who once idolized him began watching different faces. The old ones who'd survived him exhaled. No more checking mirrors. No more late-night knocks. For the first time in years, his shadow had stopped moving. And yet, there was still something dangerous behind those eyes. A glimmer. A thought forming. Because while most men folded under the weight of that kind of indictment, Alpo wasn't most men. He wasn't finished. Not yet. In the deepest part of that concrete cell, a decision was forming. One that would shake the streets even harder than his arrest. He wasn't going to go down quiet. And what came next would haunt Harlem in a whole new way. Chapter 16. The Ultimate Betrayal. Alpo turns informant. The cell door clanged shut behind him with a finality that felt biblical. Not just metal on metal, but empire on empire, crashing down in a whisper. For most men in Alpo Martinez's position, this would have been the end. An unremarkable death in a place designed to strip you of identity, power, and legacy. A quiet fade into forgottenness. But Alpo didn't see the steel bars as a cage. He saw them as leverage. He wasn't thinking about how it all ended. He was already plotting his way out. For days, he said nothing. Watched. Listened. Waited. But the walls were closing fast. The feds had built a monstrous case. Kingpin charges, multiple murders, drug trafficking, gun violations, conspiracy, RICO, stacked high like a deck no lawyer could shuffle out of. Even with a top-tier defense, Alpo faced the very real possibility of dying behind bars. Life, with no chance of parole. Not even the illusion of daylight. The kind of sentence that erases a man from the world. But the prosecution wasn't after time. They were after blood. They wanted names, networks, bodies, secrets still buried beneath Harlem concrete. And in Alpo Martinez, they saw more than a criminal. They saw a story. A witness with first-hand knowledge of murders that had eluded justice for years. A man who had played chess with the underworld, now caught in checkmate. All it would take was for him to start talking. The offer was quiet at first. A suggestion during a legal meeting. A hypothetical. A what if. But it lingered. Grew heavier with each passing day. Then came the real sit-down. Federal agents. A U.S. attorney. And the stark reality laid out on the table. Cooperate or rot. He didn't answer right away. Pride was a poison that ran deep. On the outside, snitching was the ultimate betrayal, a bullet-worthy offense. The street code was clear. No matter how bad it got, you didn't fold. You didn't talk. You died with your secrets. And Alpo had once sworn by that code. Worn it like armor. Preached it to his soldiers. Loyalty or death. No middle ground. But in that cold cell, alone, stripped of noise and power, the silence asked a different question. What was loyalty really worth if no one else kept it? The betrayal had already begun. His crew had crumbled. His inner circle had flipped. The same men he once broke bread with were now building the government's case against him. He saw the reports, read the transcripts, knew the voices by rhythm alone. And somewhere between rage and disbelief, something inside him snapped loose. If they were willing to talk, why shouldn't he? It started with a name, then a date, then a body. The words came slow at first, but once the door opened, they poured like floodwater. Alpo Martinez didn't just confess. He told stories, recounted murders with photographic detail, explained motives, locations, getaway plans. He mapped out a criminal empire with the precision of an architect. The feds couldn't believe it. Most informants gave fragments. Alpo gave novels. Complete, chilling, raw. 14 murders. That was the number. 14 bodies tied directly to him. Associates, rivals, friends, even one of his closest partners. He owned it all, calmly, coldly, without flinching. It was like he had been waiting for someone to listen, as if the years of silence had built up behind his teeth, and now he could finally exhale. The agents recorded everything. Hours and hours of tapes. His voice, casual but vivid, talking through executions like business meetings. One case involved a man he once called a brother. They'd grown up together, hustled together, made money side by side. But paranoia and ambition poisoned the bond. Alpo suspected betrayal, so he set the trap himself, lured the man in with a handshake, and ended it with a bullet. And now, he recounted it like a chapter from a dark autobiography. But it wasn't just the killings. He named dealers, suppliers, dirty cops. He unraveled alliances that law enforcement hadn't even suspected. Whole subnetworks of the drug world began to implode. Arrests followed. Indictments stacked. Trials triggered by his cooperation sent men to prison for decades. Some cried in court. Some stared daggers. But none denied what he said. The truth was too detailed. Too damning. News of his cooperation spread slowly, like poison. The streets didn't want to believe it at first. This was Alpo Martinez, the legend, the killer with a smile, Harlem's untouchable prince. But then the court records emerged. The tapes were played, the documents leaked, and the truth hit harder than any bullet. Alpo had turned. The reaction was volcanic. Former allies erased him from memory. His name became taboo in neighborhoods that once praised it. Young dealers stopped quoting him. Old-timers cursed his betrayal. Murals disappeared. Graffiti changed. The myth of Alpo, larger than life, fearless, immortal, shattered under the weight of a microphone and a deal. In prison, he was moved to protective custody. The feds couldn't risk leaving him with general population. Too many enemies. Too much bad blood. Even among other informants, Alpo was notorious. He wasn't just a rat. He was the blueprint. The man who sold out everyone, in detail, and walked with his head high. And yet, part of him didn't regret it. When questioned about his decision, he didn't offer remorse. He spoke about survival, about betrayal, about how the game had changed. He said loyalty was a lie, something bosses preached to keep foot soldiers silent. He said when the walls close in, everyone's true nature is revealed. And he, unlike the rest, had the courage to make the hard choice. But courage has a cost. Even in witness protection, Even with a new name and a different zip code, Alpo could never truly escape what he'd done. His face, once beloved in Harlem, became a symbol of duplicity. Parents warned their kids about becoming another Alpo. Friends of his victims plotted revenge they could never reach. Rap lyrics shifted from praise to disdain. The man who had once ruled the streets was now the ghost haunting them. And he knew it. Every day in hiding, in exile, he carried it. Not guilt, but weight. Like a soldier who'd survived a war by shooting his own men. He was free, technically, but not really. Freedom without respect. Safety without legacy. Life without loyalty. He had walked out of prison with a lighter sentence, but at the price of everything else. Still, there was a sliver of him that believed the story wasn't over. That somehow, someday, he'd find a way to rewrite the narrative. Maybe not redeem it, but reclaim it. Tell his side. Set the record straight. Make the world understand why he did what he did. He wasn't just a killer. Or a rat. He was a man trying to outlive a war he once thought he controlled. But the streets don't forgive. And they never forget. And somewhere, in that space between memory and vengeance, a final reckoning was already waiting. Chapter 17. Life as a Government Asset. He stepped into the sterile room wearing a borrowed face. New name, new scars, new silence. Years before, he ruled 2 cities with charm and rage. Now he was just another file number in a witness protection program. The door locked behind him with a sound that echoed like erasure. In that moment, Alpo Martinez ceased to exist. But what lived on was something darker. A king without a kingdom, safety without solitude, and a constant echo of streets he could never escape. He was relocated in the Midwest, a quiet suburb with cookie-cutter houses, trimmed lawns, and neighbors who never looked too close. A new ID, a new social security, a new routine. He got a job stocking shelves at a chain grocery store. He learned to smile politely at customers, scan barcodes, bag groceries. The fluorescent lights were harsh. The uniform itchier than any bulletproof vest. And every time he walked down those aisles, he could feel the empire he'd built slipping through his fingers. At night, after the store closed and he drove home to a beige house with a white picket fence, he listened to police scanners. Names he once commanded flickered on the radio. Someone arrested for murder. Another for dealing. Another vanished. Justice, delayed, arriving by precinct car and cuffed hands. His lips tightened. He sat in silence, cold coffee in hand, thinking about war rooms and wiretap transcripts, and the voices that once cheered his name. Now those same voices were leading him to sentences of zero freedom but full regret. He visited the victim impact panels arranged by prosecutors. He listened through a two-way mirror as mothers and sisters spoke through trembling lips, tears, trembling. One woman spoke about losing her son at 16, taken before his life began. Another about a brother she had buried with a clean shirt, because that was the only possession he'd left behind. They never knew who killed them. Didn't care. They just wanted to see someone pay, someone remorseful, someone alive. And here was the man, Alpo, sitting in a witness box, staring at blank faces that hated him. Not for exaggeration, for truth. He didn't cry. Not then. Not later. But something inside him cracked. The world he'd once owned boiled down to vending machines, cafeteria trays, and keys clicking in a locker room. Theft of a different kind. Life stolen and replaced by anonymity. He told one psychologist during mandated therapy that he missed Harlem, but more than Harlem, he missed his name. The one everybody feared, loved, envied. He said maybe what hurt most was being ordinary. Still, he was useful. Federal agents kept him on a slow drip of protection and leverage. They flew him to secure Bayside rooms to testify at trials. He sat behind bulletproof glass and gave solemn testimony on tape. Body count, dates, deals, orders. Prosecutors stitched stories from his words, and panels nodded grimly at the damage done. 17 years of sentences rolled out in courtrooms. Men would go in for the murders he admitted, the dominoes finally falling. He watched on news clips, photos of men walking past orange jumpsuits, cameras flashing, families' questions crying in court lobbyways. Guilty verdict after guilty verdict. He recognized the faces. Former soldiers of his crew, middlemen, even one of his brothers from Harlem. They were now inmates. He felt hollow, guilty, but also relieved. He'd done what he promised, brought them down. At a price. But he kept his own life, and a twisted type of loyalty to justice. In the Midwest, he started sleepwalking through routines. Walk to the bus stop. Cover the security cameras. Check the dog's food bowl. The only terror left was the terror he carried inside, that someone would find him, or that the life he once lived would sneak back through memory and drag him to death. He prayed that white suburban quiet could outpace the roar inside his head. But peace had a taste. It was bland, empty. It made power toxic. And each night, he lay awake listening to the silence he once craved. He changed apartments twice. Paid in cash. Used credit cards sparingly. He deleted social media. Bought a flip phone. No smartphone. Knock twice. Speak your name. Small measures, but they felt crucial. Because even in hiding, his name was radioactive. The people who once raised him from street dog to kingpin didn't forget easily. The betrayals he'd committed, his confession, turning informant, declaring war on code, made him worse than death in many minds. One evening, at a Kmart parking lot under buzzing neon, he looked at his reflection in the glass of his car's windshield. His eyes looked tired. When he spoke to himself, he asked a question he never thought he'd ask. Who am I now? Not who he pretended at the store, but what he remembered. He whispered it out loud. I'm the ghost they never catch. But even ghosts sometimes yearn to be alive. He followed Harlem's news, obsessively. Phone calls with trusted government handlers were strict, monitored, recorded, trimmed. Still, he got the updates. New murals of Rich Porter. Young rappers referencing the betrayal. Books commissioned. Documentaries pitched. Harlem's talkative ghost, trending as the title of a true crime podcast. He'd laugh bitterly to himself. Haunt them for a story. Paradox. Fame for being invisible. Once he dreamed he saw the street corner where he sold his first dime rock. It was late. He was 15. The corner burned bright with neon signs and boomboxes. Someone touched his shoulder. Cold hands, familiar voice. We're still out here, man. He turned. But no one was there. Only wind. He woke up clutching his chest, shirt damp with sweat. He couldn't tell if the ache was regret or longing. His new life wasn't safe, just quieter. It's easier to fade from maps than from memory. He imagined a van pulling up suddenly. Rough men dragging him away. No warning. No negotiation. But it never came. Not yet. And so he stayed in routines that felt like exile. On weekends, he drove to Walmart. Bought cheap brandy. Sat in the car. Thought about maps of New York and Washington. Thought about the bodies. Every corner he conquered. Every man he betrayed. Every gun he pulled. It was a path he couldn't turn around on. He stopped thinking in cash. Thought in regrets. In how many lives he'd ruined. In how betrayal inflates and corrodes. He once told a therapist he envied ghosts. The way they drifted unseen, untouchable, disembodied. He joked that he'd become one. But there was nothing joke-like about how alive he felt in memory and how dead he'd become in presence. One night, he got a letter. No return address. Thick envelope. Only 2 lines scratched in shaky handwriting. You'll see us soon. Inside, nothing but a Polaroid of a Harlem street corner. Night. Empty. Lit by a single lamppost. That was enough. He locked the door. Threw the letter in the trash. Burned the Polaroid in the fireplace. But he knew the message wasn't smoke. It was steel. Someone wanted him found. Maybe for revenge. Maybe for fear. The street code was clear. Snitches get stitches, or worse. The following day was harder than any surveillance op, any courtroom hearing. Fear has no sense of scale. You can't outrun it with relocation or new names. It lives inside your spine, slows your breath, and makes every shadow a suspect. He thought about going deeper, change towns again, cross borders. But fear isn't a GPS you can escape from. It travels with the mind. So he stayed. Trucks shift in, shift out. Quiet. Obscure. Alone. The world had a new Alpo Martinez now, the informant. The asset. The man who named names. The one who walked free when others fell. But inside, he remained the same man who sold crack on Harlem stoops. who commanded loyalty through murder, who smiled before death. Only now, no one cheered. He realized the final lesson of all this wasn't violence. It wasn't power. It wasn't infamy. It was anonymity, the cruelest weapon, the cage without bars. And each night, as he lay awake under fluorescent murmur of street lamps on suburban lawns, he thought, they left me behind. But he had turned himself in. The question wasn't who betrayed him. It was whether he could ever forgive himself. And the silence answered, we'll see. Chapter 18. The Streets React. The news hit Harlem like a thunderclap, sharp, jarring, and impossible to ignore. It didn't trickle through the streets. It detonated. Alpo Martinez, the prince of powder and leather seats, the man who had once turned every Harlem corner into his runway, had done the unthinkable. He'd flipped. He wasn't just a snitch. He was the snitch. The kind you never imagined because you believed he'd rather die than bend. But he did bend. And when he bent, the whole mythology surrounding him cracked. This wasn't some corner kid ratting to shave time. This was Alpo, the architect of empires, the one who lived faster than most could dream. Sitting with the feds, naming names, outlining murders like it was inventory. Barbershops fell silent when his name was mentioned. Corner crews went quiet, eyes darting, unsure how to process the betrayal. In some circles, it felt like mourning, like losing a brother. In others, it was rage, a heat that burned from the gut. For the older heads who had walked those same streets when Alpo ruled them, the betrayal struck deeper. They remembered the man who handed out $100 bills, who rolled through block parties with diamond-studded swagger and an easy grin that could turn cold in an instant. They'd seen him pull the trigger and smile afterward. They thought if anyone could hold it down, it was him. But the code, that sacred unwritten rule of the streets, had been shattered by the very man who once enforced it with bullets. The ripple wasn't just in Harlem. It was in Washington, D.C., where Alpo had turned murder into diplomacy. In both cities, his name had become something more than legend. It was currency. Fear, admiration, envy, all wrapped into one. But now, every whisper carried the stench of betrayal. Alpo had confessed to killing 14 people. He gave the feds everything. Names, routes, operations. He cracked open the underworld like a cheap safe, and the secrets poured out. And just like that, the man who once seemed invincible became untouchable in the worst way. Not even his own shadow wanted to walk beside him. Murals that once bore his face were painted over in thick, angry strokes. Graffiti artists turned his likeness into a rat, blood dripping from the teeth. One wall that had immortalized him next to Rich Porter now bore a single word in bold red spray paint. Traitor. There were no candlelight vigils for what Alpo destroyed, just cold stares and loaded Glocks. The streets don't offer grace to those who fold, especially not those who wore the crown. Men who once ran with him now ducked questions. Some fled town entirely, fearing association alone could put a target on their back. Others tried to rewrite history, saying they always knew he wasn't built for the fall, that they saw it in his eyes. But lies are easy when the lion's gone, harder when he's still breathing, still lurking, somewhere out there under a new name, a new face, shielded by the very government he used to laugh at. He was in witness protection now, living quiet. Or so they said. But Harlem didn't believe he'd stay hidden forever. You don't build your name in neon and learn to live in shadows. You don't trade Bentleys for beat-up pickups and forget what it felt like to be feared. And so the whispers began. Maybe he'll come back. Maybe he's already back. Maybe someone saw him on 125th, wearing a hoodie pulled tight, slipping into a corner bodega like a ghost revisiting his grave. And that fear, that he might walk these streets again, lit a fire beneath every crew he ever crossed. Guns were cleaned. Revenge was drafted in silence. Harlem doesn't do forgiveness. Not for rats. Not for legends turned liabilities. The thing about betrayal is, it doesn't end when the papers are signed or the deals are cut. It festers. It eats at pride. And in the world Alpo came from, pride isn't just a feeling, it's your life insurance. The outrage wasn't limited to gangsters. Mothers who once smiled at him now spat on his name. Old friends shut their doors. He'd glamorized the life, turned poison into gold, made a generation believe the crown was worth the coffin. And now, he'd ducked the coffin and left everyone else to fill it. Kids who once idolized him now looked to different figures. The myth was dead, and in its place was something colder, something darker, a warning. But despite the hatred, despite the fury, Alpo still had watchers. Not friends, not loyalists, just fascinated eyes. The same way people watch a tiger behind glass, knowing it once roamed free, knowing it still remembers the taste of blood. Some couldn't help but wonder, was he sorry? Did the guilt ever reach him at night? Did he sit in some witness protection safe house replaying the moment he signed his soul away? Or was he laughing, still playing the game, just with different rules? Alpo had always been part showman. He didn't just sell drugs, he sold a dream. Flash, style, audacity. Now, even in hiding, he had attention. He was talked about more than ever before. But in Harlem, attention can be a curse. Legends fade, traitors burn, and the streets don't keep ghosts around for long. One night, the rumor mill caught fire. Someone had seen him, driving through Harlem. Windows tinted, but music thumping. The kind of music only one man used to blast that loud. A glimpse of a grin in the rear view. No one confirmed it, but no one needed to. The possibility was enough. Enough to send the message. If you ever come back, you won't leave. The wolves are watching. The city is armed with memory. And Alpo Martinez, once Harlem's golden son, now walks the edge between myth and target. He may have escaped the courtroom. He may have signed his way into a new life. But the streets have a longer memory than the law. And somewhere, out there, Harlem waits. Not to forgive, not to forget, but to finish the story. Chapter 19, The Witness Files. He sat still in the courtroom, crisp shirt, hands folded like a schoolboy, the tension in his jaw the only thing betraying the storm beneath. The man once known as Alpo Martinez, the drug czar, the executioner, Harlem's golden outlaw, was now a government witness. But the words coming from his mouth didn't belong to a man seeking redemption. They were clinical, cold, calculated, like a surgeon recalling every cut he ever made. One by one, he named them. The men he ran with, the men he trusted, the men he buried, and the men who would soon be caged because of him. In courtrooms from New York to Washington, D.C., the name Martinez wasn't written on an indictment. It was scrawled across the testimony. Alpo's words were no longer weapons in the street, but instruments in a legal orchestra orchestrated by the feds. His confessions weren't just about his own sins. They were the thread unraveling entire crime syndicates. This wasn't just one man turning state's evidence. It was a domino falling and smashing through a whole generation of black market empire builders. His testimony led to dozens of indictments. Big names, small names, it didn't matter. If you'd ever sat at his table, you were now in danger. Michael Anthony Salters, better known as Frey, a DC heavy who once ran the blocks with surgical precision, gone. Alpo didn't just mention him. He described in detail the argument, the tension, the split-second decision that ended Frey's life. A man he once toasted with was reduced to a footnote in a courtroom transcript. But it didn't stop there. He talked about hits like others talk about errands. This one was taken out in a van. That one got it on the corner. Another one lured into a trap with the promise of money. There was no hesitation, no remorse, just facts, stacked like bricks in a wall of betrayal. And while the prosecutors called it cooperation, the streets called it treason. Every word Alpo uttered was a knife in someone's back, and every name was followed by the metallic snap of a cell door closing somewhere. There were 14 murders tied directly to Alpo's own hand, but many more were unraveled through his words. He laid out the structure of his DC operation, how coke was transported, laundered, distributed. He gave up suppliers, runners, safe houses. Places that were once invisible were suddenly under floodlights. He spoke about shootouts like weather reports, dry, unemotional, except for the occasional twitch of a smile when describing how cleanly he pulled it off. To the prosecution, he was the dream witness. To Harlem, he was the nightmare they never thought they'd see. The cases that followed were like dominoes. A slew of arrests flooded the courts. Dudes who thought they were ghosts, hidden behind layers of street loyalty and silence, were suddenly yanked into the light. There was a string of federal convictions, conspiracy charges, RICO indictments, decades handed down in minutes, families torn apart, crews dismantled, and behind every fall, there was one name whispered through clenched jaws: Alpo. One case that sent shockwaves was the conviction of Wayne "Silk" Perry, once Alpo's most feared enforcer in D.C., known for his ruthlessness and loyalty. Silk had been a living myth in the capital. People said he'd kill you for a look and do it with a grin. But now, thanks to Alpo's detailed testimony, Silk was facing life behind bars. Alpo spoke at length about how they worked together, how hits were ordered, how fear was used as currency. He turned Perry into a character witness against himself. It wasn't just betrayal. It was execution by sentence. These trials weren't just legal proceedings. They were public executions of reputation. Men who had once ruled neighborhoods were now labeled associates, co-conspirators, defendants. Their power stripped away with each passing paragraph of Alpo's testimony. There was a cruelty in how cleanly he delivered it all, as if he'd detached himself from the lives these men once lived, the memories they once shared. He cut the line and then dragged everyone else under the water with him. And yet, behind all of it was a twisted genius. Alpo didn't just talk to survive. He talked to control. Even from a witness stand, he orchestrated the room. The courtroom would still, eyes locked on him. Even in a suit and under fluorescent lights, he had that energy, the charm, the confidence, the quiet threat behind the smile. He was no longer armed, but still dangerous. Prosecutors marveled at his memory, his ability to recall dates, names, faces, and juries believed him. Because even when the truth came from the devil, it was still the truth. But what the government gained in evidence, the streets lost in blood. Families wept in court. Mothers saw their sons caged or condemned because of a man they once welcomed into their homes. The weight of his words didn't just convict, it crushed. Communities reeled, unsure who to trust. Kids raised on the myth of Alpo now watched their uncles or fathers dragged away in chains. It was a generational shockwave, and it all stemmed from one man trying to shave years off his sentence by turning his life into a weapon. The irony was thick. Alpo had spent his life silencing people, with money, fear, or bullets. Now, it was his voice doing the killing. Each syllable a gunshot. Each sentence a shovel full of dirt. There were moments in court when you could see it in his eyes, the old pride, the flash of a man who once commanded corners with a whisper. He didn't regret what he did. Not really. He regretted getting caught. But snitching? That was just business. In his mind, the game had changed, and he adapted to survive. Some say he even enjoyed it. That testifying gave him a new kind of power. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was center stage. The courts became his theater. The country his audience. His words, like bullets, reached further than any gun ever could. And for a man addicted to attention, that was its own drug. The witness files weren't just court documents. They were chapters in Alpo's second life. A second reign. This time, not with guns, but with confessions. But the price was high. He couldn't go back. Couldn't step foot in Harlem without risking instant death. His face, once a symbol of power, was now a target. His name, once legendary, now infamous. He wore a new identity, lived in another state, but the ghost of Harlem clung to him like smoke on a funeral coat. The trials may have ended. The cases may have closed. But the story wasn't finished. Because courtrooms have walls, but the streets have memories. And the names he uttered, the lives he dismantled, weren't numbers on a page. They were people. Real men. Real pain. Real consequences. And though Alpo had walked out of that courtroom, though he now lived far from the blocks that built him, one truth would follow him wherever he went. He'd buried himself with his own voice. And somewhere, in some dark corner of Harlem or D.C., someone was still listening, still watching, still waiting. Chapter 20. Silent Years in the Shadows. The engine idled softly in the moonlight. Tinted windows. A man behind the wheel. Hood up. Eyes sharp. Not nervous, just observant. The car didn't belong to the block. The man didn't belong to the city. Yet he was there, like a ghost checking his own grave. Someone thought they recognized him. That unmistakable face. A little older, a little rounder, but the eyes still held that fire. He was gone before anyone could say the name out loud. But the whispers that followed echoed like thunder through Harlem. Alpo was back. But he wasn't really. Not in the way he used to be. Not in the way the streets remembered. After all, legends don't return, they haunt. For nearly 2 decades, Alpo Martinez lived in the margins of America's story, hidden in plain sight, part of the Witness Protection Program. A new name, a new state, a new history that erased everything he used to be. On paper, he was someone else entirely. A man with no past, no rap sheet, no bullet wounds, no legacy. But you can't bury the past if it keeps breathing. And Alpo's past didn't just breathe, it screamed. Those silent years in the shadows were anything but peaceful. He may have vanished from the headlines, but his name lingered in conversations like cigarette smoke in a closed room. People didn't forget. They repeated stories, made up new ones, passed them down like cautionary tales. Every now and then, someone would say they saw him, in Atlanta, in Florida, even in California. But no sighting was ever confirmed. He was everywhere and nowhere. And that's exactly how he wanted it. Living under a new identity, Alpo tried to play the part. Clean cut, low profile, work a job, maybe even attend community events. But underneath that mask, the real Alpo still stirred. He was a man used to adrenaline, power, the eyes of the block glued to his every move. Now, the only eyes on him belonged to federal handlers and the rearview mirror. He could pretend all he wanted, but the streets had carved their rhythm into his bones. You don't unlearn that hunger. You just chain it up and pray it doesn't break loose. There were nights when he sat in silence, staring at the walls of his government-funded apartment, thinking about Harlem, about the empire, about the men he'd buried and the ones he'd betrayed. He'd told himself it was survival, business, that the rules had changed. But in the quiet, with no one left to convince, even he didn't fully believe that. His mind became a loop of memories, loud laughter over champagne, screams in alleyways, the glint of gold chains, the weight of pistols tucked beneath designer coats. Rumors circulated that he missed the life, that he still had money stashed, that he secretly kept tabs on the streets, watching from afar like a fallen god surveying a crumbling temple. Some said he had plastic surgery. Others claimed he was making moves again, low-key, using proxies. The truth was simpler and sadder. Alpo was a king without a kingdom. Alive, but not living. Free, but forever trapped. His name became taboo. In Harlem barbershops, people would speak it low, like invoking a curse. Some still admired his rise, his flash, his nerve. But even that admiration came with asterisks now. It was always followed by a shrug, a sigh, and the final word, but he snitched. That word, in the underworld, is the ultimate stain. It's not about the law, it's about the code. Alpo had broken it in the loudest way possible, and the streets don't forgive that kind of betrayal. And yet, he remained a myth, especially for the younger generation. Kids who weren't even born when he ruled Harlem but grew up hearing his name. In their minds, Alpo was a legend, something between a gangster and a ghost. They wore his story like a vintage jacket, stylish, dangerous, full of history. Some even admired the snitching, twisted by a new era that viewed survival as a kind of honor. But the old heads, the ones who were there, they knew better. They felt the cost in their bones. Even in exile, Alpo couldn't help but test the edges of his invisibility. He made calls, left breadcrumbs, reached out to old connections using fake names and encrypted apps. Sometimes he'd drive back through Harlem just to see it. Always at night, always alone, windows up, hood on. He wanted to feel something again. Maybe regret, maybe pride, maybe both. But the streets had changed. The old players were gone. The rules had evolved. And Alpo, for all his survival instincts, was a relic now. There were close calls, times when people spotted him and followed. He knew it instantly, the way the air shifted, the way people looked too long. He'd been hunted before. It was muscle memory now. A glance, a turn, a backstreet escape. The paranoia never left. It followed him like a shadow, whispered in his ear while he slept, kept his hand hovering near his waistband whenever he walked through a parking lot. He tried, once or twice, to reconnect with a normal life. Bought groceries, paid bills, even tried dating. But there's something hollow about being someone you're not. You start to slip. Maybe you use a real name by accident. Maybe you flinch when someone mentions Harlem. Maybe you smile the wrong way and they see a flash of the devil behind your teeth. He couldn't keep up the act. Not really. Because underneath the fresh clothes and quiet demeanor was a man who had once ruled through fear and fire, and that man never left. Law enforcement kept tabs. They always do. Witness protection doesn't mean freedom, it means surveillance and silence. They moved him a few times. Changed phone numbers. Threat assessments. One agent called him cooperative but restless. Another said he had a flair for visibility. That was code for trouble. They knew he wouldn't stay tucked away forever. A man like Alpo can't disappear. He just waits for the next curtain to rise. And that curtain started lifting slowly. He began showing up more. Driving through Harlem more often. People started taking pictures. Posting them. Yo, that's him. The posts would vanish within hours, but the buzz wouldn't. His return wasn't official, but it was happening. Like a ghost refusing to rest. The streets didn't know what to do with it. Some wanted revenge. Others just wanted distance. But no one wanted to forget. Because forgetting means forgiveness. And Alpo wasn't asking for that. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just watching. Hovering. Measuring the air. Like a man standing on the edge of his own grave. Wondering if he should jump in or crawl out. The years in hiding had changed him, but not enough. His silence was never peace. It was a drum roll. Waiting for the shot. And everyone knew it was coming. In the end, that's what made those years so chilling. It wasn't just the absence, it was the anticipation. The streets didn't move on. They waited, like a city holding its breath. And Alpo, forever a creature of the moment, knew the silence wouldn't last. Ghosts always returned to the scene of the crime. And someone, somewhere, was waiting with the lights off and the doors slightly open. Chapter 21. The Temptation of Fame. The glow of the screen was the only light in the room. A grainy video clip, 10 seconds long. A blurry figure steps out of a red pickup truck on a quiet street in Harlem. No sound, no context, but the comment section below is electric. That's Alpo. He's back. He wild for that. It spreads like wildfire, first on niche crime forums, then on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. A ghost had stepped back into his old kingdom, and even without saying a word, the streets were listening. Watching. Waiting. Alpo Martinez was supposed to be gone. Buried in anonymity. A witness under wraps, a traitor to the code, a name whispered but never spoken loud in public. But inside, where the silence had grown thick and poisonous, something began to itch. Not guilt. Not remorse. Recognition. He missed the eyes. The aura. The myth that wrapped itself around his name like a designer coat. Even in hiding, Alpo couldn't help but trace the outlines of the man he used to be. He had traded Harlem's stage for a shadowy corner of America, but the hunger for attention didn't die. It just got quiet. He'd started reaching out. At first, it was subtle. Anonymous emails. Burners' phones. Late-night calls to old associates, disguised behind new numbers. A fake name and a familiar voice. You could hear it in the way he spoke. Calm, measured, but itching beneath the surface. Some picked up out of curiosity. Others out of loyalty, faded but not forgotten. A few never answered again. They didn't need to. Alpo knew exactly what his voice did to people. It brought back memories, some golden, others soaked in blood. He was no longer just a man. He was a test of memory, of loyalty, of fear. He watched from a distance as the world changed. Harlem didn't look like Harlem anymore. The corner stores were slicker. The slang was different. The music had changed rhythms. But beneath the surface, he could still feel it, the pulse of the hustle. The hunger. The code, bent but not broken. He'd once been the center of it all. Now he was a footnote on the lips of rappers, the subject of hood documentaries, a headline remembered more than a man. That was the thing about fame. It fed you once, then left you starving forever. And so, Alpo flirted with the edge. He started to show up. Not loudly, but deliberately. Quick rides through his old blocks. A glance here, a smirk there. Like a retired lion testing the boundaries of a new jungle. He knew the risks. One wrong sighting, one wrong stare, and it could all be over. But something stronger than caution had taken hold of him. Temptation. Not for money, not even for power, but for the intoxicating rush of being seen. There was a strange irony to it all. He had once killed to protect his secrets, and now he was risking everything just to be remembered. Some part of him believed that if he could just return, even quietly, he could rewrite the final chapter of his story. Control the narrative. Regain the throne, if only in spirit. He wasn't stupid. He knew he wouldn't be welcomed with open arms. But maybe, just maybe, some part of the streets still respected him, or feared him. And in his world, those were two sides of the same coin. He began planting seeds. A few whispers about a documentary. Talks of writing a book. Behind-the-scenes footage that magically surfaced online, showing him talking about the past with that trademark charisma. Laughing, recounting murders like old basketball highlights. It was jarring, unsettling, but captivating. The streets couldn't look away. The younger generation saw a gangster turned ghost turned content creator. The old heads saw a dead man walking. Every move he made now had weight. He knew eyes were back on him. The FBI. Old enemies. People who'd spent decades fantasizing about revenge. He had escaped death once. Maybe twice. But Harlem wasn't a city that forgot. It was a city that remembered slowly, and then all at once. Every person he'd wronged had a cousin, a friend, someone still breathing with a grudge. And every car he sat in, every route he took, was a coin toss between nostalgia and his obituary. Still, he pressed on, like a moth circling the flame. Fame had always been his addiction. Not the drugs. Not even the money. The power came from the presence. The way people parted when he walked into a room. The way his name traveled faster than bullets. That energy doesn't just leave you. It lives inside your bones, scratching at the walls of your soul. And in hiding, that energy had turned into a kind of madness. He started dressing the part again. No more bland witness protection fits. He wore hoodies with Harlem logos. Drove a truck too flashy for the quiet towns he was supposed to blend into. He wanted to be seen, not just as a man, but as a myth. He watched other ex-gangsters go on Vlad TV, podcasts, interviews, telling their stories, owning their truth. He saw the views, the followers, the comments, and he thought, why not me? I live this. I am this. But there was a line, and he knew it. Returning to Harlem wasn't just reckless. It was suicidal. Still, the pull got stronger. The idea that maybe, just maybe, he could walk those streets again, not as a fugitive, but as a man who outlasted his enemies. Harlem had made him. Maybe Harlem would forgive him, or at least understand him. He fantasized about it, sitting on a stoop, watching the block move. The faces might have changed, but the feeling, he hoped, would still be there. Maybe someone would nod in recognition. Maybe someone would run. Either way, he'd feel alive again. Not just alive, but real. Because in witness protection, you aren't real. You're a phantom in someone else's story. And Alpo Martinez had always demanded to be the main character. Behind all the bravado, there was a deeper truth. He was lonely, isolated, haunted. For all his talk, all his stories, he knew what he'd lost. Trust, brotherhood, legacy. Even his enemies had more authentic connections to the streets than he did now. He was the ghost in the machine, the man who had traded everything for survival, and now wondered if survival was worth the silence. He began circling Harlem like a satellite, close enough to see, far enough to flee. He made plans, contacts, maybe a quiet comeback, a soft reentry. But the closer he got, the more he felt the air changing. Eyes sharpened, whispers got louder. Old beefs resurfaced. Time hadn't healed anything. It had just sharpened the blade. Every time he crossed into the city, it was like walking on a frozen lake, each step a crack in the ice. But still he walked. And on one of those nights, as he rolled slowly through the streets in a tinted truck, a question echoed in his mind like a pulse. If a ghost walks among the living, How long before someone tries to send him back to the grave? Chapter 22. The Return of Alpo. The engine roared through the Harlem night like thunder ripping across a cemetery. A Ducati, sleek, black, unapologetically loud, cut through the avenues with its rider sitting tall. No mask, no helmet, no fear, just a man who wasn't supposed to exist anymore. And yet, there he was, Alpo Martinez, riding through Harlem like it was 1989 again. The ghost had returned, not in silence, but in full defiance of death. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't a sighting from someone confused by shadows. This time, it was real. He was back, in the flesh, under his government name. Not Pedro, the one the witness protection program handed him. Not an alias buried in some quiet town. He was Alpo, and he wanted Harlem to know it. Word traveled fast. Faster than that motorcycle. 1 minute, he was spotted on Frederick Douglass Boulevard, flashing that trademark smile. The next, someone caught him on camera near St. Nicholas Park. By dawn, the clips were viral. People weren't sure what to believe. Was it really him? Was he suicidal? Or just tired of running? Those who recognized him couldn't believe their eyes. There was a swagger in his walk, untouched by time. A certain rhythm in his voice when he greeted the old heads leaning against corner store walls. Some nodded back, unsure whether it was out of respect or shock. Others turned away, not wanting to be seen with him. But even silence speaks volumes in Harlem, and Alpo knew how to read the quiet. He stopped by old haunts, the barber shops, the bodegas, a few stoops that still held memories of laughter and blood. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wore fitted jeans, crisp sneakers, and designer shirts, like he never missed a beat. His truck stood out like a sore thumb. Loud rims, loud music, but even louder was the tension that followed him everywhere he went. Harlem remembered. Harlem never forgets. Some whispered that he was testing the waters, trying to see who would approach him, who would look away, who still held a grudge. Others said he was flaunting it, spitting in the face of the very code he had shattered. That infamous code of silence. That oath never to talk, never to turn. He had betrayed it once, and now he had the audacity to return to the scene of the crime, like a thief revisiting a house he'd already robbed. The streets felt it, an unease that draped itself over the blocks like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Young kids didn't know the full story. To them, he was the subject of documentaries and rap verses. A legend, a villain, a riddle. But the old heads knew. They remembered the chaos, the killings, the way Harlem shook when Alpo's name was mentioned. And they remembered the betrayal, the ultimate betrayal. 14 bodies, and he still walked free because he'd opened his mouth and pointed fingers. So why come back? Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was that dangerous cocktail of ego and loneliness that only a man like Alpo could sip without flinching. Whatever it was, he needed to be seen. He needed Harlem to remember not just the snitch, but the kingpin, the charmer, the dealer who once ran these streets like a crowned prince. He reconnected with some of his old crew, those still breathing, still free, still foolish enough to answer his call. He'd pull up, dap them up, and talk like nothing had changed, like decades hadn't passed, like blood hadn't dried on concrete years ago. Some welcomed him, hesitant but curious. Others barely looked him in the eye. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal, it scabs over. And scabs, when picked at, bleed again. There was something eerie about watching him walk through Harlem like it still belonged to him. He moved with the confidence of a man who defied death, betrayal, and time itself. But beneath that surface was something else, desperation. A quiet tremble that only the most perceptive could catch. Because for all his showmanship, Alpo knew he was on borrowed time. One night, he stood outside a Dominican spot on Amsterdam Avenue, leaning against his truck, talking to a few locals, laughing, reminiscing, a cigarette in one hand, the other resting near his waistband. Always alert, always calculating. But it wasn't the cops he feared anymore. It was the ghosts, the enemies, the sons of men he'd buried, the ones who'd sworn to even the score, no matter how many years had passed. He tried to tell his story in bits and pieces, to anyone who would listen. He spun tales about the game, about how it used to be, He talked about honor, about how the new generation didn't know loyalty. But every word sounded hollow, like a song out of tune, because the truth was, he had violated every rule he now preached. A man who betrays his crew and reappears in the same streets, hoping for redemption, doesn't want forgiveness. He wants resurrection, and resurrection requires belief. Alpo needed Harlem to believe in the myth again. But Harlem, hard as concrete and twice as cold, didn't give out second chances. It gave out warnings. And if those were ignored, it gave out death. Still, he stayed. Days turned into weeks. He moved around like he had something to prove. Not to others, but to himself. Maybe he believed that if he could walk these streets and survive, he could reclaim some lost part of his soul. That if the city that made him could look him in the eye again, he might feel whole. But every legend has an expiration date, and every return has a cost. One night, a familiar face warned him, "Yo, pa, you really shouldn't be out here like this." He shrugged it off, smiled, said something slick, something cocky. That was Alpo, always deflecting with charm. But the warning stayed with him. He started checking his mirrors more often, watching the windows, limiting his circles. But it was too late. The genie was out. The streets were talking. And this time, they weren't whispering. He thought he could rewrite the narrative. Thought he could wear the mask of redemption over a face etched in betrayal. But Harlem wasn't interested in rewrites. Harlem was a city of consequences. A place where debts are inherited like old furniture. And Alpo had run up a tab too high to ignore. The night air grew colder. Eyes sharpened. Doors closed. And somewhere in the shadows, someone waited. Someone who had been listening. Watching. Someone who never forgot. Because no matter how fast you ride, no matter how loud the engine roars, you can't outrun what's coming. Chapter 23. Harlem sees a ghost. It began with a chill, a ripple through Harlem's concrete veins. A whisper in the barber shops. A murmur outside bodegas. A ghost had returned, and his name was Alpo. People thought it was a joke at first. A rumor. Something stirred up by old heads who missed the drama of the 80s. But then someone snapped a photo. Blurry, grainy, and undeniably real. He was standing outside a deli on 139th, in broad daylight, sunglasses on, leaning against a candy-red bike like it was still his corner. Harlem stopped. For years, Alpo Martinez had been the unspoken myth, the cautionary tale, the specter no one dared name aloud. He was supposed to be gone, buried somewhere in the witness protection program, living out his days with a new name and a new face. But suddenly, there he was, back in the same streets where he built his empire, betrayed his brother in arms, and shattered every code the game was built on. And worse, he acted like he belonged. People didn't know how to react. Some stared in stunned disbelief, lips parted but words caught in their throats. Others kept their heads down, not wanting their eyes to lock with his. But a few dared to ask why? Why come back? What was he chasing? Redemption? Infamy? Or something more dangerous? Relevance? It was like seeing a dead man walking, but this wasn't no Hollywood script. This was 2021 Harlem. The place had changed, buildings remodeled, gentrification spreading like vines. But the memory of what had happened on those blocks had not faded. The cracks in the pavement still told the story. Rich Porter's blood, Mike Frey's final breath, 100 hushed funerals, and the sound of mothers crying into cold pillows. And now, the man who'd orchestrated so much of it was riding motorcycles through Lenox Avenue, giving nods like the past was water under the bridge. But in Harlem, bridges burn never rebuild. They just smolder until someone decides to finish the job. Alpo's presence created a fracture in the neighborhood's soul. To the young ones, those raised on rap lyrics and grainy YouTube documentaries, he was the stuff of legend. A mythical figure who once made millions, drove candy-painted cars, and laughed in the face of the feds. They saw his return as something cinematic, the kingpin reborn. But the older generation, the ones who lived it, bled through it, buried friends because of it, they saw something else. A traitor, a ghost with blood on his hands and no remorse in his eyes. And to them, Harlem was sacred ground. You don't get to defile it and then come back like you never left. Not without consequence. People began posting sightings. Videos surfaced. Yo, Alpo just walked past 125th, like it's nothing. I seen him at the gas station, swear to God. The videos were quick, shaky, often taken from behind car windows. No one was bold enough to get too close. Fear wrapped itself around curiosity. No one wanted to be next to the target if, or when, karma came calling. And still Alpo smiled. He was a man out of time, trying to wear his past like a jacket that no longer fit. He still wore flashy gear, still rocked expensive shades and sneakers too clean for Harlem's sidewalks. But there was something in his eyes, something restless. He knew the walls were closing in, even if he didn't say it out loud. There was talk of him trying to re-establish ties, reaching out to familiar faces, flashing cash, telling stories. But the room would always go quiet when he entered. People didn't know whether to embrace him or spit in his direction. And that's the thing about ghosts. They might wear flesh and bone, but the weight of their sins never fades. One night, he pulled up to a block party like nothing had changed. Music bumping, kids dancing, smoke in the air. People looked up and froze. Some nodded, unsure. Others turned away. He stood there, scanning the crowd like a king surveying his kingdom. But his crown was cracked, and the people no longer bowed. Some said he was chasing closure. That maybe, deep down, Alpo needed Harlem to forgive him so he could finally forgive himself. But forgiveness doesn't live on those streets. What lives there is memory. And memory, in Harlem, is sharper than any blade. In whispered conversations, old vendettas were unearthed. Names remembered. Promises revisited. Harlem didn't scream. It simmered. It waited. Because the code he broke wasn't just about drugs or money. It was about loyalty. Brotherhood. Lines that, once crossed, never disappear. And yet, Alpo kept walking. Like he was daring fate to find him. He was seen outside clubs, laughing, buying drinks, talking loud, like the past had evaporated. But every street corner held a ghost from the life he'd destroyed. Every car that rolled slow made him glance twice. Every unfamiliar face made his hand inch toward his waistband. He wasn't stupid. He knew what he was doing. But pride has a way of distorting logic, especially in men who once ruled the underworld. The confusion among Harlem's people deepened. Some said maybe he was untouchable, that maybe his deals with the government had made him too risky to kill. Others believed he was untouchable because he was already dead, spiritually, socially. What could you take from a man who'd already sold his soul? Still, the fear crept back in. Those who remembered the old days started locking their doors again, watching their backs. Because if Alpo could come back, who else could? The fascination, though, was undeniable. Every move he made was dissected online. Who he was with, what he was wearing. People were trying to solve the riddle. Was he back for good? Was he planning something? Or was this the final act of a man who couldn't bear being forgotten? But the most unsettling part wasn't that he came back. It was that he came back unapologetic. No shame. No explanation. Just the same grin he wore in the courtroom when he pointed fingers to save himself. He was trying to write his own ending, one final twist before the curtain dropped. But Harlem didn't want a storybook ending. Harlem wanted justice. And justice doesn't come in apologies. It comes in shadows. It comes in silence. Each day he walked those streets, the pressure tightened. The whispers grew louder. The patience grew thinner. Everyone knew how this would end. It was just a matter of who, when, and how loud the final shot would echo. Because when a ghost returns to the land of the living, the dead don't rest easy. And Harlem had never forgotten. Chapter 24, Old Scores, New Enemies. It was never a question of if. It was always when. The moment Alpo Martinez set foot back in Harlem, a quiet clock started ticking in the minds of men who had long buried their anger in shallow graves. Resentments from decades ago, thought to be cold, dormant, woke like old wounds touched by winter air. People who had learned to survive without revenge suddenly felt the sting of opportunity. And with that opportunity came danger, unspoken, thick in the air like gunpowder before a storm. For years, names had been whispered behind locked doors. Faces remembered through grief, betrayal, and headlines. Rich Porter, Michael Frey, Charles Brown. The list ran long and deep. And though many of the original players were either dead or locked away, their families were still around. Their friends were still watching. Their neighborhoods still remembered. In the code of the street, some debts never expire. And Alpo, walking those streets again, was a living IOU. One man, still bitter from the 80s, was heard saying, "He's walking around like he ain't got no ghosts." But ghosts walk too. That sentiment echoed across Harlem's backstreets. It crept into pool halls, lingered at the edges of cookouts, and sat quietly in the corner booths of soul food joints where the OGs still held court. No one needed to say it out loud, but the message was clear. Alpo had made himself visible again, which meant he was once again touchable. What made it more volatile was how bold he was. There was no fear in his stride, no hint of the man who had turned state's evidence and vanished into the federal system. He was still riding flashy motorcycles, still speaking loudly, still dressing like he was untouchable. It rubbed the wrong way against the very people whose lives he had broken apart. And the more he smiled, the more someone, somewhere, wanted to see that smile erased. Old beefs don't die. They simmer. And with every new sighting, with every Instagram story that featured his blurred silhouette, another ember caught flame. You could feel it building, a low hum under the rhythm of Harlem's heartbeat. The city had modernized, yes. But vengeance still wore Timberlands and didn't speak unless it had to. The younger generation watched with wide eyes, trying to understand the weight of what this meant. To them, Alpo was just a name from DVDs, from street DVDs and documentaries. A legend. But for the people who lived those years, who held crying mothers and ducked bullets on stoops, he was no myth. He was a reminder of what the game used to be, of what betrayal really looked like. And Harlem doesn't forget betrayal. There were those who had lost brothers because of him, friends who were never found, promises made to dead men under streetlights. It wasn't always about justice. It was about restoring balance. In a world governed by silent codes and invisible lines, Alpo had violated the one law you could never come back from. You don't turn on your own, especially not after benefiting from the very blood you spilled. There were rumors now, quiet ones, that certain people had been seen asking questions, old names popping up in new conversations, young shooters asking their elders, "Is that really him?" as if seeking permission. And while most were too smart to act recklessly, everyone knew it only took one. One person with enough pain, enough rage, enough pride. One person who couldn't sleep at night knowing Alpo was back, alive, laughing, like none of it ever happened. Some were even saying he'd been reaching out to former allies, trying to rebuild something, or maybe just reconnect with a past he couldn't let go. But that was the thing. He was the only one pretending that time hadn't moved on. Everyone else had evolved, shifted, buried the past under layers of survival. And now he was digging it back up, bone by bone. At first, people thought maybe he was protected, that the feds wouldn't let him walk without some kind of buffer, that maybe he was bait for something bigger. But if that was true, it wasn't visible. He was too free, too relaxed. He moved like a man with nothing left to fear, or like a man who knew the end was coming and didn't care. One night, someone posted a grainy video. Alpo talking to a group of younger men outside a building. He was smiling, telling stories, trying to hold court like the old days. But what he didn't see, what no camera could capture, was the way some of those kids looked at him. Not with awe, not even respect, but with calculation. In their eyes, he wasn't a king. He was a target, a relic of a time they didn't know loyalty to. And that made him even more vulnerable. Enemies old and new were watching. Some didn't even have personal history with him, but the street currency of killing a man like Alpo, that kind of reputation lasts forever. In that world, infamy is a ladder, and blood is a shortcut to the top. The whispers grew sharper. One OG said, "He out here like it's still 88. Like he didn't flip. Like he didn't bury half the city in caskets and indictments." That quote made the rounds. On social media, in text threads, in late-night calls where the real ones still spoke in code. And through it all, Alpo kept moving like a man untouched. But he was touched by time, by regret, by the growing sense that something was coming for him. Maybe he felt it in the way people no longer held his eye. or in the subtle tension that followed him into every room. But the cracks were forming. And in Harlem, once they form, they don't heal. They shatter. There were sightings outside old schools, at gas stations, leaning on cars that cost more than some folks made in a year. Each time, it felt like a dare, like he was challenging history to come find him. And maybe that's what he wanted. Maybe the guilt had calcified into something reckless. Maybe he couldn't live in the shadows anymore. Or maybe he truly believed he could rewrite the ending, control the narrative, leave his mark one more time before the lights went out. But the streets had a different script. Alpo had written his story in blood, and now the ink was drying. Old scores had long memories, and new enemies had young fingers on triggers. By the end of that summer, the city pulsed with unspoken tension. Something was going to happen. Everyone knew it. It wasn't a matter of if. It was how close. It was how loud. It was how fast the past would finally catch up. Chapter 25. Chasing Clout and Death. The streets of Harlem were never silent. Even in the quietest moments, they hummed with memory. Pavement remembers blood. Corners remember betrayal. And in the final days of Alpo Martinez's strange return, that memory sharpened into something deadly. He had come back to reclaim a piece of his legend. But legends, when they stay too long, become ghosts. And ghosts don't get second chances. It was Halloween night. The city wore its mask. Crowds spilled into the streets with laughter and chaos, dressed like skeletons, demons, superheroes. But one man didn't wear a costume. Alpo rode through Harlem on his motorcycle. No disguise, no shame, no fear. The same man who had once haunted the blocks in silence was now tearing through them like he wanted everyone to know. Not just that he was back, but that he wasn't hiding. That message was loud, but so was the silence that followed him. He revved his bike like a dare, a taunt, like he believed the myth of himself was still stronger than the bullets chasing his past. And maybe he did believe it. Maybe, in his mind, the streets still owed him something: respect, awe, acknowledgement. He had lived as a king once, and he couldn't let go of the crown. But the throne he remembered was now made of bones, and each ghost beneath it had a name. People were watching, cameras on corners, eyes behind tinted glass. Some couldn't believe it. Others simply stared in disgust. A few smiled, tight, shallow things that didn't reach the eyes. The kind of smile that comes before a storm. In the weeks before that night, Alpo had begun stepping out more often. He wasn't just passing through Harlem anymore. He was living in it. Not in the shadows, but in broad daylight. Rumors swirled about parties in the Bronx, dinners in Harlem restaurants where his name used to carry weight. He was taking pictures with kids who didn't even know the real him, flirting with women half his age, throwing money like the 80s had never ended. Some said he was chasing clout. Others said he was chasing death. The truth? He was probably chasing both. Alpo had always needed to be seen. That was his drug. More than heroin, more than crack, more than the millions he once stacked in shoeboxes. He fed off recognition, the way people froze when they heard his name. He didn't just sell drugs. He sold fear, charisma, danger. And in his mind, that brand still held value. But the market had changed. The game had changed. And most of all, Harlem had changed. This wasn't the Harlem of 20 years ago. The new generation wasn't impressed by old war stories. They didn't care about how many bricks you flipped in '88 or how many bodies you buried before turning government witness. They judged you by different standards now: respect, legacy, loyalty. And in their eyes, Alpo had failed the test. He had killed a friend, turned on his crew, then disappeared behind a wall of federal protection only to reemerge, smiling like nothing had ever happened. There was no honor in that. Not in the eyes of those who had grown up without their fathers, whose uncles had been taken off the board because of his testimony. Every appearance he made in Harlem was like lighting a match near gasoline. It wasn't just bold, it was reckless. People whispered that he was trying to shoot a documentary, that he wanted to cash in on his story, that he was planning a comeback. But he misread the room. This wasn't a city waiting for his redemption arc. It was a powder keg, and he was walking through it with a torch. There's a difference between being remembered and being welcomed. Alpo confused the two. Every block he rode down, every time his name was posted on social media, The air got heavier. Old heads started meeting behind closed doors again, not to reminisce, but to calculate. A few OGs tried to talk sense. Said, let him fade. He's not worth it. But the streets don't listen to logic. They listen to pain. And Harlem was still bleeding from wounds Alpo had left open. The week before Halloween, someone spotted him talking to a known associate, someone from the old world. They stood outside a building for 10 minutes. No words could be heard, but the body language said everything. Alpo was laughing, like the streets were still his, like time had made him immune. But the man he was talking to wasn't laughing. He just nodded, arms folded, eyes scanning the street like a man who knew that even conversations had consequences. One night, Alpo pulled up to a block party. Not invited, just showed up. Some people froze. Others walked away. A few pulled out their phones, recording like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Here he was, walking history. But the footage didn't go viral out of nostalgia. It went viral out of warning. Like the city itself was saying, he's here. And this won't last. There's a thing about the streets. They rarely scream. They watch. They wait. And when they move, it's swift, cold, final. Alpo may have thought he was building buzz, reviving the myth. But what he was really doing was making himself a target. Not just for old enemies, but for new ones eager to make a name. Harlem is a stage, but the audience is armed. By the time Halloween arrived, the buzz was deafening. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was taunting fate. And fate doesn't flinch. That night, as he rode through Harlem on his motorcycle, something shifted. The city felt tighter, like it was holding its breath. Lights flickered in apartment windows. Conversations slowed on stoops. And somewhere, in the shadow of those projects he once ruled, someone made a decision. The details of what happened next are still debated. But the aftermath wasn't. Just before dawn, on Frederick Douglass Boulevard near 151st Street, shots rang out. Multiple rounds. A black Dodge Ram riddled with bullet holes. The driver slumped behind the wheel. Dead on arrival. The man inside had multiple IDs on him. But the streets didn't need confirmation. They knew. Harlem doesn't forget faces, especially the ones it once feared. News spread like wildfire. First in whispers, then in headlines, then in history books. Alpo Martinez was dead. For some, it was closure. For others, it was justice. For many, it was a warning. The streets had spoken, and they spoke in silence. Chapter 26, Halloween 2021, The Hit. The night didn't start out as death. It started with noise, laughter, music, the kind of Halloween chaos that fills the streets of Harlem with mischief and masks. Kids in costumes dodged between parked cars. Grown men leaned against storefronts with beers and blunts, watching the show. The city was alive. But in the distance, death was already in motion. Just after midnight, a black Dodge Ram truck rolled up Frederick Douglass Boulevard, past 151st Street. The driver didn't wear a costume. He didn't need one. In the front seat sat a man whose name once made Harlem hold its breath. A man who had lived 3 lives: dealer, killer, informant. And now, he was chasing a 4th. He wore a red hoodie and leaned back like the city still belonged to him. It didn't. Shots rang out. Rapid. Brutal. At least 5 bullets tore through the side window and windshield, one after the other like punctuation marks to a forgotten sentence. The truck veered, then stopped. The engine kept humming, but the driver did not. When the police arrived, the man had multiple IDs. One was fake, but the real one, the name stitched into the bloodstream of Harlem's memory, was Alberto Geddes Martinez. Known to the world as Alpo, the news hit Harlem like a slow-moving explosion. In the early hours of Halloween morning, the streets murmured with disbelief. Phones lit up. Faces froze. The ghost who had walked so boldly among the living had finally vanished, for good. But no one was surprised, only stunned that it had taken this long. He had tempted fate too many times. Rode through Harlem like a man untouched. Posed for pictures. Bragged in whispers. Acted like the bulletproof aura of his youth could still hold up against decades of betrayal. But Harlem doesn't forget. The soil remembers who fed it blood. In those final months, Alpo had been a contradiction, living large and laying low all at once. He wanted to be seen, but also feared being watched. He craved recognition but dreaded the cost. He was no longer the kingpin who ruled with charm and a gun. He was something else. A relic. A loose end. A man too loud for the shadows and too dangerous for the light. The details of the hit remain murky. No arrests. No suspects. No motive officially confirmed. But everyone had theories. Some said it was a revenge hit. Old beef finally brought to a boil. Others whispered it was a message from the streets. There are no second lives. Once you cross the line, you're marked forever. There's something eerie about dying on Halloween. As if the city itself chose the night. The masks. The chaos. The illusion of safety. Alpo had been walking among ghosts for years. Now, he had become one. Not the spectral kind that fades into nothing, but the kind that stays. In murals. In war stories. In the trembling hands of those who once feared him. His death didn't come with a grand shootout or final words. It came quietly, suddenly, like a trapdoor opening beneath his feet. One moment, he was gliding through Harlem like a phantom on wheels. The next, he was slumped in a truck with blood on his chest and silence in his throat. Police canvassed the area. Shell casings were bagged. Witnesses dodged questions. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. But everyone knew everything. That's Harlem code. At the scene, a few onlookers whispered about karma. Others shook their heads, not out of sympathy, but out of acknowledgement. They had seen this coming. The streets had been patient, waiting like a slow fuse. And now, the explosion had finally arrived. His body was taken away before dawn. A sheet over his face. A legend zipped into a bag. But the story was far from over. The ripple effects of that night stretched through every borough, every prison tier, every barbershop conversation. The fall of Alpo wasn't just the end of a man. It was the final chapter of a myth that had haunted the city for over 3 decades. In the hours after his death, his name trended on social media. Some called him a rat. Others called him a king. Most called him what he was, complicated. A man who built an empire on drugs, death, and charisma, then burned it all down to save himself. His decision to cooperate with the feds had stained his legacy. And yet, his death recrowned him in a strange way. In Harlem, dying in the streets is still a kind of martyrdom. But was it justice? Or just the inevitable? There are no easy answers when it comes to Alpo. He killed men who trusted him. He made millions poisoning neighborhoods. But he also fed families, protected his block, inspired fear and admiration in equal measure. He was a paradox in Timberlands and gold chains. A walking contradiction who talked too much and lived too loud. His funeral was quiet. No massive procession. No gold casket. Just a few faces behind tinted glass and a legacy no one could agree on. Some wanted to forget him. Others couldn't stop talking about him. But silence was never Alpo's style. Even in death, his name echoed. The mystery of who pulled the trigger will likely stay unsolved. Harlem doesn't need answers. It deals in messages. And the message that night was clear. Ghosts don't belong among the living. In the end, it wasn't the police or the feds or some rival from D.C. It was time. It was memory. It was the street's long, slow vengeance. On Halloween night in 2021, Alpo Martinez finally paid the price. The talkative ghost went silent. Chapter 27. Who killed Alpo? The SUV rolled through Harlem's night like a ghost carriage, black-tinted windows reflecting the orange flicker of streetlights, the last ride of a man who'd long outlived the laws of the street. It was the morning after Halloween, but the mask was finally gone. At exactly 3:20 in the morning, multiple gunshots cracked through the quiet like snapped bones. Alpo Martinez, once the king of Harlem's crack era, slumped over the steering wheel of his Dodge Ram, bleeding out onto the same streets he once ruled. His death was violent, precise, and intentional, but his killer, or killers, slipped into the shadows, leaving only questions and old ghosts behind. The immediate aftermath was a swirl of flashing lights and cold suspicion. Detectives combed through surveillance footage. Bystanders whispered. The crime scene was frozen in time, but Harlem itself kept moving. People had seen it coming. Others swore it would never happen. But by the time the sun rose, one question was already gripping the city like a noose. Who killed Alpo Martinez? Revenge. It's the most popular theory. And in Alpo's world, there was no shortage of people who had cause. For years, he'd worn a target on his back the size of an entire borough. To some, his death was karma knocking. To others, it was a prophecy fulfilled. But if revenge was the motive, who among the many had pulled the trigger? Rich Porter's name came up almost instantly. Not because he was alive, but because his memory still lived like a ghost in Harlem's DNA. Alpo had confessed to killing Rich, his closest friend turned rival. It was a betrayal so deep, so raw, that decades later, it still pulsed in the hearts of Porter's surviving family and friends. The timing, the location, the execution, it all had the feel of a long-awaited vendetta finally coming full circle. But street vengeance doesn't age well. Time passes. Rage fades. Some say Rich Porter's family wouldn't have dared risk prison to settle a score from the 90s. Others whisper that revenge doesn't always come from family. It comes from legacy. A cousin, an old crew member, someone who grew up hearing the name Rich Porter like a hymn of the fallen. Maybe they weren't seeking justice. Maybe they were chasing a legend of their own. Then there's the drug angle. In his final years, Alpo wasn't just hiding. He was allegedly back in the game. Quietly, carefully, but the streets always know. Rumors swirled that he'd gotten into an argument just weeks before his death. Something about a package gone wrong. A handshake deal that turned sour. Was it a new beef? Or an old one reignited? Did he cross someone with fresh connections, but old scars? These were no longer the drug wars of the 80s, but violence in that world has never gone out of style. Harlem's new generation had grown up hearing stories about Alpo. For some, he was a mythical figure, untouchable, flamboyant, brutal. For others, he was a cautionary tale, a snitch, a traitor, a ghost who refused to stay buried. His return to the neighborhood was bold, brazen even, riding motorcycles, flashing money, smiling in selfies with people too young to understand the blood he left behind. But the older heads? They remembered, and not everyone was willing to forgive. Police sources remained tight-lipped, officially. No arrests, no suspects, just an open homicide file and a wall of silence from a community still conflicted. Who do you trust when the victim was both the villain and the myth? Tips came in. Most led nowhere. Every new rumor opened a new door, only to find another locked one behind it. There were whispers of professional hitmen, of federal setups, of ex-cons trying to earn their stripes. There were even wild theories about Alpo staging his own death. Paranoia and legend twisted like smoke through Harlem's alleyways. In the end, there are too many suspects and not enough proof. And maybe that's the way it was meant to be. Alpo had made his name on betrayal, on switching sides when it suited him, on killing those closest to him when power was at stake. When he flipped for the feds and confessed to 14 murders, he signed his own death warrant, one that remained valid no matter how many years passed. For the streets, forgiveness has never been free, and redemption isn't a currency they trade in. The deeper you look, the murkier it gets. There were no witnesses willing to speak, no camera footage clear enough to make an arrest. The bullet holes in his chest were like punctuation marks on an unfinished sentence. Who killed Alpo? It's not just a question. It's a reflection of everything he was, everything he did, and everyone he left behind. Some say it was justice. Some say it was murder. But in the eyes of Harlem, the two often wear the same face. And as the case goes cold, the legend burns hotter. Because sometimes ghosts don't haunt places. They haunt legacies. And in Alpo Martinez's case, the ghost haunts everyone. Chapter 28. The Legacy of Alpo Martinez. He died behind the wheel of a Dodge Ram, bullets tearing through flesh and glass as Halloween masks still floated through the Harlem night. But Alpo Martinez, Harlem's most infamous ghost, was already dead long before that final shot rang out. What remained in the wake of his murder was not just a corpse riddled with vengeance, but a legacy twisted like barbed wire. Part legend, part villain, part cautionary tale. A name whispered in barbershops, studied in street lore, and condemned in the very same breath that once worshipped it. In the end, Alpo became something more terrifying than a kingpin. He became a contradiction that refused to die. To the kids on the corner, Alpo's story played out like a fable with a broken moral. A street hero who flew too close to the sun. His rise had all the ingredients of a myth: charm, hustle, betrayal, and blood. But his fall, that was something else entirely, something colder, uglier. Alpo didn't crash. He slithered. He confessed. He ratted. He traded silence for survival. And for many, that sin outweighed every murder he ever committed. To the old-timers, Alpo's ghost wasn't just haunting Harlem. It was haunting the very meaning of loyalty. Some still recall the flash of his smile, the roar of his bike on Lenox Avenue, the arrogance with which he strolled streets that once crowned him king. It wasn't just guts, it was madness. In Harlem, betrayal doesn't fade with time. It calcifies. It settles into the cracks of pavement and memory. So when Alpo returned, visible again, under his real name, it wasn't nostalgia he stirred. It was unfinished business. His murder wasn't a tragedy to some. It was punctuation, an exclamation mark to a story many believed had ended years ago. Yet even now, his legend refuses to stay buried. YouTube videos dissect his life. Rap lyrics breathe him back into rhythm. Documentaries, gossip, interviews with men who knew him or claimed to play like ghost stories told around digital campfires. But each telling carries a different truth. To some, Alpo was the embodiment of Harlem hustle, quick-witted, ruthless, stylish. To others, he was a traitor who turned state's witness and wore his sins like a crown. No one can agree on who the real Alpo was, because he wore masks even when it wasn't Halloween. He was the smiling kid from East Harlem with a gift for gab. He was the ruthless killer who shot friends without flinching. He was the man who snitched on his entire crew to save himself. And he was the reckless ghost who returned home, knowing death was waiting. Each version is true, and each version is a lie. In courtrooms, his testimony helped dismantle drug operations stretching from Harlem to D.C. Names were named. Murders detailed. Men sentenced. He confessed to killing Rich Porter, the very brother-in-arms whose name once helped build Alpo's own legend. And yet, when he walked free years later, many couldn't believe it. The same man who had personally admitted to 14 murders was now shopping at corner stores, fist-bumping kids, riding motorcycles in broad daylight. If hell had an exit door, it looked a lot like Alpo's. The street code, always spoken, never written, crumbled around him. Young hustlers were left with questions their elders couldn't answer. If Alpo could kill, flip, and live, what did loyalty even mean anymore? He forced the streets to look in the mirror, and the reflection was cracked. There was no honor, just survival. No glory, just illusion. His name became the very proof that the game was broken. In D.C., where his reputation had once drawn blood and respect, he's remembered with less complexity. There, he was the outsider who came in like a storm and left a trail of dead bodies and broken crews. The memories are colder, the scars deeper. Harlem may have loved him once, but D.C. never did. And when he flipped, those grudges turned generational. Entire bloodlines cursed his name. Even in death, that venom hasn't faded. There were rumors that Alpo tried to reclaim his place in Harlem's underworld before his death, that he was testing waters, sizing up the new players, trying to see if there was still a crown to wear. But the streets had changed. The rules had changed. The people had changed. Harlem no longer moved to the rhythm he once controlled. He was a ghost dancing in a city that had long outgrown him. Yet even ghosts leave footprints. Ask any Harlem native over 30, and they'll tell you about the days when Alpo reigned, when his cars lit up the night, when his crew ran blocks with precision and violence, when fear followed him like a shadow. They'll speak in half-whispers, part awe, part bitterness. Because for all the pain he left behind, there's still that dangerous admiration. The way he climbed, the way he styled, the way he played the game until it played him. He made the streets look glamorous, even as bodies dropped. That was his true crime. More than the murders, more than the betrayal. He made destruction look divine. To the young and hungry, that illusion is still seductive, still dangerous, still alive. Parents still warn their children about becoming the next Alpo, not because of his crimes, but because of how easily he became everything and lost it all. He's the modern-day Icarus of Harlem. His wings weren't made of wax, but of pride, bullets, and broken codes. And when he fell, the flames lit up more than just his story. They scorched the myth of street immortality. And yet, here we are, still talking, still dissecting, still haunted. That's the cruel irony of legacy. It belongs to those who talk about you, not to you. And Alpo, in death, is bigger than he ever was in life. He wanted to be remembered, and he is, just not the way he thought. The final act of his story didn't happen in a courtroom, or on a block, or in an interrogation room. It happened on a Harlem street, in the early morning hours of Halloween. His blood stained the very pavement that once praised his name. That's the real ending. Not dramatic, not noble, just sudden, cold, final. But endings are strange things. Because while Alpo's body is gone, his story lives on, in podcasts, in music, in documentaries like this. Some will say he got what he deserved. Others will say he deserved more. But one truth remains unshaken. Alpo Martinez changed the game. And the game never changed back. He died as he lived, chasing the shadow of his own legend. And in doing so, he became exactly what he feared most. A ghost. This is Outlaw Icons. Your sleepy dawn.